Two Bad Men. A brutal Western thriller of outlaws, blood, and the price of freedom. Chapter 1. Every man thinks he's the worst thing in the room. Most of them are wrong. Anonymous. The limestone ridge ran east to west like a scar somebody had stopped caring about, and the Butterfield stage came up over it at 2:15 in the afternoon, with the driver already complaining about the left wheel hub to nobody in particular, and the 6 passengers inside sealed behind canvas curtains against a June that wanted to cook everything it touched. Amos Purdy had driven this stretch of the San Antonio-El Paso run, going on 11 years, and had developed specific opinions about the country between the Medina River crossing and the Sabinal cutoff. His opinion was that it was a country that liked to kill things, horses, wagon springs, men with soft hands who thought the West was a magazine illustration. The heat came up off the pale rock and the cedar and the dry creek beds and hit you across the face the way a man hits another man when he wants to make a point, and not just a mark. He was thinking about the wheel hub, and not about the 2 riders parked sideways across the road when the stage cleared the ridge. He saw them at 120 yards, maybe less. He pulled back on the reins, and the 4 horses bunched up and complained, and the stage rocked forward on its thoroughbraces. Beside him on the box, Wells Fargo messenger Clyde Birch reached down between his knees for the 10-gauge and had it halfway up when the taller rider put a rifle round through the crown of Purdy's hat. Not through Purdy's head. Through the hat. The hat spun off the box and landed in the road behind them. "Leave that gun where it lives," the taller rider called up. His voice carried easy over the distance. He wasn't yelling. He had the kind of voice that expected to be heard. "And hold those animals still." Birch held the 10-gauge at his knees and did not bring it up the rest of the way. He was 41 years old and had a wife in Castroville who kept a kitchen garden and argued about money, and whom he loved with an intensity that surprised him still. He thought about her in the 2 seconds he spent deciding what to do with the shotgun. He set it back down between his knees. Purdy got the horses stopped. His hat was in the road 20 feet back, and the sun hit the top of his head like something personal. The taller one was Harlan Cutter, 26 years old, 6 feet and an inch of him, with a face that the sun had gone to work on early and not been gentle about. He rode a blood bay gelding with a white sock on the near foreleg, and he sat that horse with the loose economy of a man who had spent more time horseback than anywhere else. He wore his gun on his left hip, butt forward, and he'd been wearing it that way since he was 16, and had never felt the need to explain it to anyone. The shorter one was Dade Cutter, 22, and he was the reason Harlan had learned to talk fast in certain situations. Dade had their father's coloring, dark, quick eyes and hair that went black as boot leather in the summer, and their mother's complete inability to sit still inside a plan. He'd already put his horse 10 feet further down the road than they'd agreed on, and was turned sideways in the saddle, reading the faces up on the box. "How many inside?" Dade said without looking at Harlan. "6, Harlan said. "Same as the manifest." "Could be more." "It can't be more than what was on the manifest, Dade. That's what the manifest is for." Dade considered this. "I'm just saying." "Stop saying and watch the box." Harlan rode up to the stage at a walk. The horses smelled him and his horse, and shifted against each other. He kept the rifle across his thighs, muzzle easy, not pointed at Purdy or at Birch specifically, but in their general direction, which was close enough. "Down from the box," he said. "Both of you. Leave the long gun." Purdy climbed down first. His legs were stiff from the box, and he moved like a man whose body was working on a different schedule than his intentions. He landed in the road and straightened and looked at Harlan, and Harlan looked back at him, and neither one of them said anything for a moment. "I've got a wife," Purdy said. Most men do, Harlan said. Come around front with me. Birch came down off the box slower, watching Harlan's hands, watching the muzzle. He was thinking about the 10 gauge still sitting up there on the box, and he was thinking about the distance and the math of it, and the math kept coming out wrong. He left the gun. He came around to the front of the stage and stood with Purdy in the road, and the 4 horses breathed and stamped, and the dust settled back down around them all. Dade swung down and went to the coach door. He pulled it open, the way a man opens a door he owns. Inside, a cattle buyer from San Antonio named Greer, who had enough whiskey in him already that the morning had gone soft at the edges. A Methodist minister named Pollard, traveling to Del Rio to take up a post that nobody else had wanted. 2 land surveyors partners named Voss and Kellerman with their instruments in a wooden case between them. A woman named Mrs. Ida Beaumont, 53, traveling to see her sister, and a younger woman, 20 or 21, who had not given her name at the San Antonio depot, and who had spent the entire ride looking out the gap in the curtain at the country going by. Dade looked at them. They looked back at him, the way people look at something they can't quite believe is happening. Everybody out, he said. Bring what you're carrying. Leave what's in the boot. They put them in a line in the road. 6 passengers, 2 crew. 8 people, standing in the limestone dust in the afternoon sun on a ridge in Uvalde County, with the cedar scrub pressing in on both sides, and the sky above them white and enormous and empty. The younger woman was the last one out of the coach. She stepped down without a hand from anyone, and stood at the end of the line, and looked at Harlan with an expression that was not fear exactly. It was more like recognition, as if she'd known this was out here somewhere, and had simply been waiting to run into it. Harlan noticed her the way he noticed everything, catalogued her and moved on. She was not the problem right now. The problem was Dade, working down the line with a flour sack he'd pulled from his coat. Greer, the cattle buyer, tried to argue about a pocket watch. Dade took the watch and hit him across the ear with the flat of his hand, and Greer sat down in the road and touched the side of his head carefully like he wasn't sure what he'd find there. Dade kept moving. Harlan held the rifle on the line and watched Birch. Birch was the only one with the physics to be a problem. He could see the man doing the arithmetic. Same arithmetic he'd been doing up on the box, same wrong answer. The minister Pollard asked if they were going to be harmed. We're robbing you, Harlan said. Not harming you. There's a difference. Then God. Leave God out of the road, Harlan said. He's not involved here. Dade came back with the flour sack. $1,130 in coin and paper, 3 rings off fingers, a brooch off Mrs. Bowman's collar, and Greer's gold watch, which had his initials on the case, and a small daguerreotype of a woman inside who was not, from the look of Greer's face when they took it, his wife. Also, the wooden case belonging to the surveyors, which Dade had cracked open and found full of instruments that meant nothing to him. Leave the case, Harlan said. Might be worth something. It's surveying equipment, Dade. It's worth something to a surveyor. Dade looked at the case. He set it in the road. He looked like he was doing a calculation he resented. Harlan swung down from his horse. He walked to the front of the line and stood in front of Birch and looked at him for a moment. I want to see the box, he said. No key, Birch said. Keys in San Antonio. Every messenger says that. Every messenger who's smart. Harlan looked at him. He wasn't angry. He had a quality of stillness that some men mistake for patience and other men, smarter ones, recognize for what it actually is. The key, he said. Birch reached into his vest and produced a key on a short chain. He held it out, and Harlan took it and didn't say anything else to Birch because there wasn't anything else to say. The Wells Fargo box came down off the boot, and Harlan worked the lock and got it open, and found $420 in banknotes consigned to a merchant in Presidio, a leather envelope with land deeds that he dropped in the road, and a smaller lockbox inside the larger one that took a different key, which Birch didn't have, and which Harlan broke open against the wheel hub. Inside the smaller box, nothing. An empty velvet interior, the color of a bruise. What was in here? I don't know what's in the boxes, Birch said. I deliver the boxes. Harlan looked at the velvet and thought about it for a moment, and then let it go. You didn't work a problem that wasn't there anymore. He stood up and looked down the line of 8 people standing in the June road and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was a pulling sensation in the chest that might have been satisfaction. He'd thought about this moment for a long time. It didn't feel the way he'd thought it would feel. It felt more real and less large. Dade was beside him now, flour sack in hand, grinning. That's it, Dade said. We're done. Harlan looked at the 8 people in the road. We're not done, he said. Dade's grin changed shape. It took less than 3 minutes. It was ugly and loud and final, the way those things always are, and afterward the ridge went quiet again, except for the horses moving against their traces, and a crow somewhere in the cedar that called twice and quit. Harlan stood at the edge of the road and looked at what he'd made and felt nothing he could name. The younger woman, the one who'd looked at him like she'd been expecting him, was the last one. She hadn't cried or begged. She'd looked at him with that same expression of flat recognition and said, I've got nothing that matters to you. He'd done it anyway. He'd had to. You couldn't leave 8 people alive on a ridge a mile from the road with your faces clear in their heads and expect to get to Mexico before supper. That was what he told himself, and it was true, and it was also not the whole truth, but he let that be what it was. Dade was already on his horse. He had the flour sack over his saddle horn, and he was looking south, and he was grinning again, the ugly shape of the grin that had replaced the other one. He'd found something in the last 3 minutes that Harlan had not found, and Harlan filed that away in the part of his mind where he kept things that didn't have a right category yet. Borders 8 hours, Dade said. We ride hard, we're in Piedras Negras by midnight. Harlan swung up on the blood bay. He didn't look back at the ridge. He'd looked at it enough. Ride, he said. They went south into the white afternoon, and the country closed in behind them the way country does, indifferent, which is its own kind of judgment. The telegraph operator at the San Antonio depot was a man named Fitch, who had been sending and receiving messages for Wells Fargo and the U.S. Mail and the occasional Texas Ranger office for going on 9 years, and who had developed the professional detachment of a man who handles other people's emergencies for a living. He read the incoming message from the Sabinal relay station and read it again, and then took it himself in person and at a walk that was nearly a run to the Wells Fargo district agent's office on Commerce Street. The agent's name was Pruitt. He read the message and stood up from behind his desk and walked to the window and looked out at Commerce Street without seeing any of it. 8 dead. Stage horses still in the traces when a vaquero from the Medina Ranch found them 3 hours after the fact. Box cracked, manifested funds missing. No witnesses. He went back to his desk and wrote 2 telegrams. The first went to the U.S. Marshal's district office in Austin. The second he addressed personally, because he knew the name and knew what the name meant, and understood that the Marshal's office would take a week to organize itself while the trail went cold. He addressed it to Brackettville, Kinney County. He wrote, Cutter Brothers. 8 dead on Medina Ridge. 400 offered. Reply. He thought about what he'd written and added, delivery condition flexible. He had Fitch send it before noon. The stone house sat at the end of a 2-track that ran off the Brackettville Del Rio Road for about a quarter mile, and then stopped because the man who built it had decided that was far enough from the road and far enough from everything else. The walls were 2 feet of caliche block, and the roof was sheet iron over cedar beams, and in the summer it was about 10 degrees cooler than outside, which was the difference between merely hot and the other thing. The man who lived in it had a garden on the south side that grew chilies and tomatoes and a variety of squash that he'd gotten seed for from a Kickapoo woman at the Hacienda Creek camp, and that produced more than he could eat. He gave the surplus to the Mexican family that ran cattle on the adjacent section. He asked nothing for it. He didn't particularly want a relationship. He just didn't want the squash to go to rot in the heat. His name was Eldridge Sample, and he had been a Texas Ranger for 19 years, the last 4 of those as a sergeant in Captain Hollis's company out of San Antonio, until 1876, when a disagreement with Hollis about the disposition of 2 Comanche prisoners had resolved itself in a way that ended Sample's career in the Rangers and very nearly ended Hollis's capacity to walk without a cane. He was 51 years old. He'd been shot 4 times in 19 years, twice by the same man, which was a thing that still irritated him when the weather changed. And he had a bad left knee that had been bad since a horse fell on it in 1869, and that had only gotten more opinionated in the years since. He was not a large man. He was built like something the country had shaped and compressed over a long time, broad through the chest and shoulders and narrow everywhere else, with hands that were out of proportion to the rest of him, big-knuckled and brown, and a face that had stopped being young somewhere around 1860 and hadn't changed much since. He was sitting on the east side of the house in the shade at 4:30 in the afternoon, when the boy from the telegraph office in Brackettville rode out with Pruitt's message. The boy's name was Cephas, and he was 14, and he was afraid of Sample in the way that all the young men in Kinney County were afraid of Sample, which was not a fear of anything he'd done to them specifically, but of something they sensed in him the way animals sense a change in the air. Sample read the telegram, set it on his knee, drank his coffee, read it again, put it on the table inside, and came back out and sat down and finished the coffee. The country south of the house ran out flat and dry toward the Rio Grande, greasewood and lechuguilla, and the occasional shin-oak, twisted by wind into something that looked like a man in an argument. The light on it this time of afternoon was the color of old brass. "You want a reply?" Cephas said. He was still on his horse, which was how he preferred conversations with Sample. Higher ground. Sample looked at the country. "Tell him accepted," Sample said. "Tell him I'll want the names of every man Cutter has done business with in Uvalde, Zavala, and Kinney County. Tell him I'll be in San Antonio in 3 days, and I want that information waiting." "Yes, sir," Cephas said. "That's a lot to remember." "Write it down." "Yes, sir." Cephas took a stub of pencil from his shirt pocket and did not appear to have paper. He looked at Sample. Sample went inside and came back with a folded piece of paper and a pencil that had more use left in it. He gave them to the boy and watched him write. The boy wrote slowly and with the concentration of someone who understood that the words mattered. "Sir," Cephas said when he'd finished. "What did the Cutters do?" "Killed 8 people on a stage on the Medina Ridge." The boy absorbed this. He was old enough to know what it meant, and young enough that it still had the power to change the quality of the air around him. "Are they bad men?" he said. Sample looked at the country again. The light was going amber now, dropping toward the red end. "They're men who think they are," he said, "which is a different thing." Cephas rode back toward town. Sample watched him go, and then went inside and began to consider what he needed to take and what he needed to leave. He did not rush. He had done this before, more times than he could put a number to, and the rushing was the thing that got men killed. Not the danger itself, not the territory, not the men you were hunting, but the way urgency made you stop thinking clearly and start thinking fast, which were not the same quality of thought at all. He packed one saddlebag with the patience of a man who understood that everything going into it might need to be retrieved in the dark or in a hurry or in the dark and in a hurry, and he placed each item accordingly. The Cutter brothers had an 8-hour head start and were probably across the river already. Sample had caught men who were 3 weeks ahead of him. He was not worried about the time. He was interested in the distance, which was a different relationship to have with a problem. He put the lamp out at 9 o'clock and lay on his bunk in the dark and listened to the country outside the stone walls and thought about a limestone ridge and 2 men who had done something on it and who were currently somewhere in Mexico feeling large. He thought about the 8 people in the road. He did not sleep for a while. Then he did. In the morning, he would go to San Antonio. He would look at the ridge. He would look at the ground and the horses and whatever the bodies told him before they were put in the earth. He would talk to the man Fitch at the telegraph office and the man Pruitt at the Wells Fargo office and a woman on Dolorosa Street whose name was Celestina and who knew every piece of news that moved through the border country the way water knows the shape of every channel. He had been in this business long enough to know that the beginning of a hunt is not the moment you ride out. The beginning is the moment you understand what kind of men you're hunting and what kind of country you're hunting them in. Everything before that is just traveling. He slept. Outside the stone house the night went about its business. The coyotes on the ridge to the north, the dry wind off the Sonoran that smelled of dust, and something flowering somewhere far off. The Rio Grande moving in the dark a dozen miles south, indifferent and permanent and old. In the morning, there would be a trail. There was always a trail. Chapter 2. A patient man isn't waiting. He's already somewhere you haven't arrived yet. Anonymous. He rode out to the Medina Ridge 3 days after the killing and 2 days after the bodies had been taken off it, and the country didn't care either way. The cedar was still cedar. The limestone was still limestone. The June heat pressed down on everything with the same democratic indifference it pressed on the living. Sample dismounted at the top of the ridge and stood in the road and looked at it. Most men, coming to a place like this, look at what's in front of them. Sample looked at the geometry. He stood where the stage driver would have stood when he first saw the 2 riders blocking the road, and he turned and looked back the way the stage had come. And then he turned and looked at the angle of light and the angle of the road and the cedar scrub on both sides and the distance to the nearest cover, and he built a picture in his mind the way a surveyor builds a map, not what it looks like but what it means. The tire tracks were still in the limestone dust, cut deep where the stage had come up hard on the brake. He walked the right side of the road north for 40 yards and found where the first rider had stood his horse. The horse had dug in at the left rear, impatient or excited, and turned twice in the same spot waiting. He crouched and looked at the hoof prints. Unshod on the right 4. The left 4 recently shod, different smith than the right. A horse assembled from whatever was available, which told him something about where the man had been and how he'd been living. He found the second rider's position 20 feet further down the road and off to the left, which was not where the accounts said he should have been. The accounts said both riders came at the stage together, side by side, which is how a witness remembers a thing that scared them, simplified, flattened, the details compressed into the shape of the feeling. But the ground said one rider held back, and one rider moved up, and the one who moved up did the talking while the one who held back did the watching. That was a practiced division of labor. These were not two men who woke up one morning and decided to rob a stage. They'd thought it through. Or one of them had. He worked the scene for an hour and a half. He found 3 spent casings in the cedar off the east side of the road and pocketed them. He found where a man had stood at the rear of the stage working on something and then moved to the wheel hub. The scrape marks of iron on stone were fresh and clean at the edge, not weathered. He found the land deeds from the Wells Fargo box dropped in the road, which the county deputy had apparently not thought worth retrieving, and he picked them up and looked at them and put them in his coat. He found one more thing that nobody else had noted. 30 feet off the south side of the road, in the thin shade of a live oak that had been fighting the limestone for 100 years and winning narrowly, he found the impression of a boot heel in a patch of caliche mud left from a rain 4 days prior. Small boot. A woman's boot or a boy's. Pressed in deep and steady, not shifted, not turned. Someone had stood there for a while and not moved and not been found. He looked at the impression for a long time. He looked at the angle of the live oak relative to the road. You could see the road from here, but the cedar between the oak and the road was dense enough that you couldn't see far into the cedar from the road. He looked at the distance to the nearest point where a horse could have been tied without being heard from the road. That was possible. That was about 40 yards further south. He walked the 40 yards. In the soft ground, at the base of a dry creek bank, he found 2 sets of horse prints and the arc where an animal had been pivoting on a short line for an hour or more. 2 horses. Both shod and recently so. Same smith this time, same nail pattern, which meant they'd been taken to the same place at the same time to be reshod, which meant someone had done the cutter's horsework for them before the job. He stood at the creek bank and looked back north toward the road. Someone had been here, watching. Someone who was not the cutter's and was not among the dead. He filed that away and went back to his horse. Pruitt's office on Commerce Street smelled of paper and anxiety and the particular brand of coffee that gets made in offices where men drink it all day without pleasure. The man himself was compact and careful and had the look of someone who had been managing bad news for a living long enough that it no longer surprised him, which Sample recognized as a useful quality in a person you needed honest information from. Harlan Cutter, Pruitt said, and opened a folder on his desk that was thicker than Sample had expected. We've had his name in a file for about 2 years. Nothing prosecuted. Suspicion on a freight wagon robbery outside Uvalde in '77. Suspicion on a horse theft ring operating between here and Laredo. The Rangers looked at him twice, and both times came up with nothing nailed down. Because they couldn't, or because someone told them to stop looking? Pruitt looked at him steadily. I'm not in a position to speculate about the Rangers. I'm not asking you to speculate. I'm asking what you know. Pruitt considered the distinction, and apparently found it acceptable. There's a man named Toll in Uvalde, Cephas Toll, runs a livestock brokerage, who has done business with the Cutter family for 10 years. The father's dead. But the business continued with the boys. The Rangers' second inquiry apparently got as far as Toll's name, and then the file went quiet. Who was the Ranger? Captain Hollis's company. Sample looked at the window. Commerce Street moved past it the way Commerce Street always moved. Mules, freight wagons, a woman with a parasol navigating the ruts. He kept his face at the window long enough that what was on it went away. Tell me about the younger one, he said. Pruitt shuffled papers. Dade Cutter. Less of a file. One arrest in Laredo in '78, drunk and disorderly, released the same night. There's an account from a deputy in Eagle Pass who says a man matching his description was involved in a knifing at a Fandango house in March. Other man didn't die, no charges filed. Pruitt paused. The deputy's account uses the word volatile. Means he does things before he's thought them through. That's how I read it. What about the empty lockbox? The inner one. Pruitt's expression changed by something small, but readable. The consignment on that box was confidential. I understand that. I'm asking anyway. Mr. Sample. Somebody knew that box was going to be on that stage, and knew approximately what was in it, Sample said. And that somebody is either one of your people or somebody your people talked to, and the Cutters got the information from that chain somewhere. The inner box was the point of the job. Everything else was opportunity. You understand the difference? Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Outside on Commerce Street, a mule said something emphatic about its situation. The box contained a private letter of credit, Pruitt said finally. Drawn on a bank in Mexico City. Negotiable by the bearer. How much? $8,000. Sample absorbed this. He let it sit for a moment, and then he put it with the other things he knew, and looked at the shape it made. So the stage robbery isn't a stage robbery, he said. It's a courier theft with casualties. The 8 people are still dead, Mr. Sample. They are, he said. And whoever arranged the job knew they would be, which means whoever arranged the job is not the Cutter brothers, because the Cutter brothers are not the kind of men people hire to be discreet. He stood up. Who was the letter of credit made out to? A land company. Incorporated in Austin. Pruitt said the name. It didn't mean anything to Sample yet. I'll need that written down, Sample said. And the name of whatever bank in San Antonio they do business with. Pruitt wrote it and handed it across the desk, and Sample folded it into his coat with the land deeds. One more thing, Sample said. The manifest said 6 passengers. I want the booking records. Names where each one boarded, who purchased the tickets. Pruitt looked at him carefully. You think one of the passengers was involved? I think someone was watching from the tree line with 2 horses and left before the shooting started, Sample said. I don't know yet if that was a passenger who got off early or someone who was never on the stage. But I'll want the records. He left Pruitt with his folder and his anxiety and his bad coffee and walked down Commerce Street to the telegraph office. Fitch was a small man with a large mustache who had developed the professional habit of appearing not to listen to anything while in fact listening to everything. He gave Sample the same account he'd already given the county sheriff and the deputy U.S. Marshal and the 2 rangers who'd come through in the first 24 hours. The incoming message from the Sabinal relay, the time he'd received it, the time he'd taken it to Pruitt. Then Sample asked him what else had moved through the wire in the 48 hours before the robbery. Fitch's mustache moved. I don't recall everything that comes through, Mr. Sample. There's considerable volume on a given day. I'm not asking for everything. I'm asking about anything addressed to Uvalde County or originating from it. Anything with a number in the body of the message, specific numbers, dollar amounts, or dates. Fitch looked at him with the expression of a man deciding how cooperative he wanted to be with someone who was not a ranger and not a marshal and not technically anything at all except a private citizen with a reputation that Fitch had been hearing about for years from various directions. I keep a log, Fitch said. I know you do. The log was a cloth-bound ledger that Fitch kept behind the counter and did not show to people as a general rule. He showed it to Sample. Sample went through the previous 4 days with a finger moving down the columns: sender, recipient, relay station, time received, time sent. He found 2 messages originating from Uvalde in the 48 hours before the robbery. One was a cattle price inquiry to a broker in Corpus Christi. The other was addressed to a hotel in San Antonio and signed with initials that Fitch had copied faithfully, CT. Sample looked at the initials. He thought about the livestock broker in Uvalde, whose name was Cephas Toll. What hotel? Fitch pointed at the entry. The Menger. Did the Menger reply? Fitch ran his finger forward through the log. There was no reply. Could it have gone through a different office? Could have, Fitch said, if someone didn't want it logged here. He paused. There's an office at the depot. Southern Pacific. Less traffic, less oversight. Sample put his hat on. I appreciate the log, he said. You didn't see it, Fitch said. See what? Sample said, and went out into the heat of Commerce Street. Dolorosa Street in the early evening was its own world, separate from the Anglo-commerce of Commerce Street in the way that a river's south bank is always different from its north, same water moving past, different character of ground. The houses here were adobe and caliche block, the yards full of oleander and the smell of cooking, and the sounds of families doing what families do at the end of a day. The woman named Celestina lived in a house near the end of the block behind a wall of fig trees that were old enough to have opinions about the space they occupied. She was 56 or 57. She'd told Sample different things at different times, and he'd concluded she simply didn't consider it settled information. And she had come to San Antonio from Monclova 30 years ago with a husband who had died of cholera in 1861 and left her with a house, 3 children who were now grown and scattered, and a network of correspondences and connections that ran from San Antonio to Mexico City in one direction and to New Orleans in the other. She knew things. She knew them, the way a river knows where the low ground is, not because she sought the information out, but because information ran toward her naturally, following the grade. She was sitting on her porch with a glass of something cool when Sample came through the fig trees. She watched him come up the path, the way she watched everything, with a quality of attention that missed nothing and appeared to miss everything. Eldridge, she said. Not a greeting exactly. More like confirmation of a fact she'd expected. Celestina. He took his hat off and sat in the chair she indicated and accepted the glass she poured without asking what was in it. It was hibiscus water with something added that was cold and faintly bitter. He drank it. The Medina Ridge business, she said. Yes. I heard about it 2 days ago. 8 people. She looked at the fig trees. The young woman on the manifest, the one who booked at the last moment, no name recorded, she was not a passenger. Sample set his glass down. He waited. She worked for a man in this city, whose name I will not say in my own house, Celestina said. She was there to confirm the letter of credit was on the stage. She was supposed to signal from the road when the stage passed, and then leave. She was not supposed to be in the trees when the shooting happened. But she was. She was. Because the man she worked for doesn't tell his people everything they need to know to keep themselves alive. He tells them enough to be useful. She said this without heat, the way you state a law of nature. Is she alive? She came back to the city yesterday morning. She is. Celestina searched for the word. Unsettled. I need to talk to her. She won't talk to you. She's afraid of the man she works for, in a way that is deeper than the fear of what you represent. What do I represent? Celestina looked at him with the kind of directness that most people acquire only after they've stopped caring what the other person thinks of what they're about to say. Consequences, she said. But the consequences you bring are visible ones. His are not. Sample turned his glass in his hands. The evening was settling in around the fig trees, the light going gold and lateral. The letter of credit. 8,000. The land company it was made out to, he said the name. Something moved behind Celestina's eyes. Quick and then gone. Where did you get that name? Pruitt. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that company dissolved 8 months ago. Whatever assets it held were transferred. I don't know to what. Who ran it? Incorporation papers would show you a lawyer's name. The lawyer's name would not be the right name. She looked at him carefully. Eldridge. The Cutter brothers are the easy part of this. I know that. The man who arranged it, he's not a man who responds well to being looked at directly. Few of them are. This one has reach, she said. Into offices. Into courts. You understand what I mean. He understood. He'd run into reach before. In his experience, reach had a physical location the same as everything else, and a physical location could be visited. The Cutters first, he said. The other thing when I get back. If you get back. When, he said. Not correcting her. Just the word, flat and certain, the way you'd state a compass direction. She poured him more of the hibiscus water, and they sat in the fig trees while the evening finished what it was doing to the light. The Southern Pacific Telegraph office at the depot was a room the size of a generous closet attached to the east end of the freight building. The operator there was young, 20 at most, and had not yet developed Fitch's professional detachment. He was nervous in the way that young men are nervous when a person they don't know asks questions in a tone that suggests the answers are expected to be correct. Sample showed him nothing official because Sample had nothing official to show. He described himself as working for Wells Fargo, which was true enough to say with a level face, and he asked about outgoing messages in the 2 days preceding the robbery. The young operator said the office didn't keep public records in the same way. Sample put $3 on the counter. The young operator found the records. There had been one message routed through the Southern Pacific office to Uvalde in the period Sample specified. It had originated from a sender who gave his name as Burgess and no other identifier. It had been addressed to no specific person, but to the general delivery at the Uvalde post office. The body of the message was 4 words, Thursday. The arrangement stands. Thursday was the day of the robbery. Sample looked at the message entry in the operator's log and thought about the man Pruitt had described. The dissolved land company, the letter of credit, the woman in the trees who'd been sent to confirm and not to see what she'd seen. He thought about a man who routes his messages through a freight depot instead of the main telegraph office. A man who plans around the log. Cautious men were harder to find than careless ones. But they were not unfindable. The man who brought this in, Sample said. Describe him. The operator described a man of middle age, medium build, well-dressed, who had come in at 7 in the morning when the office was quiet, and paid in exact coin, and left without conversation. He had a hat pulled down, and the operator couldn't be sure of the hair color. He'd walked east when he left the office, toward the river. His hands, Sample said. The operator thought about it. Clean, he said. No calluses, I could see. He wore a ring on the right hand. Plain band looked like silver. Sample thanked him and left the $3 and went out into the depot yard where the evening freight was being staged, and the air smelled of coal smoke and horse, and the particular iron smell of train rails in summer heat. He stood in the yard and looked east toward the river. A cautious man with clean hands and a silver ring who walked toward the river at 7 in the morning. He put that away with the rest of it. He spent the night at a boarding house on Nueva Street, run by a woman named Mrs. Contreras, who had been feeding Sam Houston's Rangers and their successors for 30 years, and who asked no questions and kept a good table. He ate beef and beans and cornbread, and drank coffee, and went to bed at 9 o'clock, and lay in the dark with the sounds of the city coming through the open window, cartwheels on the stone street, music from somewhere on the river, the night birds doing their accounting in the pecan trees. He ran through what he had. The Cutter brothers had robbed the stage and killed 8 people. That part was simple. Harlan was the planner. Dade was the instrument, and together they'd executed a job that was someone else's idea down to the specific target. They'd taken the letter of credit, and the cash, and the jewelry, and they were in Mexico, probably Piedras Negras, because that was where the border crossers went, who didn't know the river well enough to cross anywhere else. In Mexico they were spending money and feeling famous, and the longer they felt famous, the more noise they made, because that was the nature of men like Dade Cutter, and to a lesser extent Harlan. The job was never entirely the point. The reputation was the point, and reputation was loud. Behind the Cutters, there was another man. The man who'd known about the letter of credit, who'd used a livestock broker in Uvalde named Toll to reach the brothers and put the job together, who'd sent a woman to watch the road and hadn't bothered to tell her she'd be watching a massacre, who routed his telegrams through a freight depot and dissolved his corporations before anyone could read them properly. Sample didn't have a name for that man yet. He had a direction, east from the depot toward the river, and a silver ring and clean hands and a quality of caution that told him the man had done this kind of thing before and knew which edges to keep smooth. He'd find the Cutters first. They'd know the broker Toll. Toll would know more about the arrangement, and the arrangement would eventually lead him to the man with the silver ring, who was sitting somewhere in this city or this county right now, behind a desk most likely, in a room with his name on the door, feeling safe. Most dangerous thing a man could do, Sample had found, was feel safe. He slept. In the morning, he was on the road south by 5:30 before the city woke all the way up, the blood bay moving through the blue pre-dawn with its ears forward and its stride long and easy. The road ran toward Laredo, and then he'd angle west toward the border crossing at Eagle Pass, which was south of the Cutter brothers' most likely crossing point, and would let him come at Piedras Negras from a direction they wouldn't be watching. He was 4 days behind them. He did not ride hard. A man who rides hard to close a gap arrives tired. Sample rode at a pace that covered ground without spending the horse, and he thought while he rode, which was the closest he came to comfort, moving through the country with a problem to turn over in his mind, and the road ahead empty, and the light coming up behind him slow and red off the limestone. Deputy Augie Renfrew caught up to him 4 miles south of the city. Renfrew was 34 and built like a man who had been meant to be larger and had run out of material partway through. He had an honest face and a cautious manner, and had been a deputy in Bexar County long enough to know which problems to approach carefully and which ones to leave alone. He'd put Sample in both categories at different times and hadn't fully resolved the question. He pulled alongside Sample and matched his pace. He didn't say anything for about a quarter mile, which Sample appreciated. "Mr. Sample," he said finally. "Deputy, the marshal's office has 2 men on the Cutter brothers. I expect you know that. I do. They're headed for Eagle Pass. Sample said nothing. I'm not telling you to stand down, Renfrew said. He seemed to have prepared this and was delivering it carefully. I don't have the authority, and I'm not sure I have the inclination. What I'm saying is there are legal instruments involved here, and there's a process, and the marshal's office would prefer. I'll bring them back, Sample said. Or back is what they'll be headed. Renfrew absorbed this. The road went through a stand of live oak, and the light dropped and then came back. Pruitt told me you found something at the scene. At the ridge. Something we missed. A boot print in caliche mud under a live oak 30 feet off the road. A boot print. Small. A woman or a boy. Somebody watched the job and left before the shooting. 2 horses tied at the creek bank south of the road. Renfrew was quiet for a moment. That's not in any of our accounts. No. You know who it was. I have a direction. Are you going to tell me? Not today. Renfrew took this with the equanimity of a man who had learned that Sample told you what he decided to tell you, and that pushing on the rest of it was like pushing on the caliche. It didn't move, and you just hurt your hand. You understand, Renfrew said, after another quarter mile, that what you're doing down there is outside any legal framework. Mexico generally is. And if something happens, to the Cutters, I mean, in terms of the condition they come back in. Pruitt's offer says dead is acceptable, Sample said. He put it more politely than that, but that's what it says. Pruitt's not the law. No, Sample said. He's the money. That's different, and in some situations it's more useful. Renfrew pulled his horse up and let Sample go on. Sample didn't look back. He heard the deputy's horse standing in the road behind him, and then he heard it turn and go back toward the city. The road opened up south of the live oaks, and the country went flat and pale and long. The blood bay stretched into its stride, and the miles started coming off. Ahead of him, some number of days and miles that he'd close at his own pace, and in his own order, the Cutter brothers were in a cantina somewhere feeling large. They had $1,100 of other people's money, and a letter of credit drawn on a Mexico City bank worth $8,000 more, and they had no idea what the letter of credit meant, or who had wanted it, or who else might come looking for it now that they had it. That letter of credit was going to be a problem for the Cutters. Men who wanted $8,000 didn't stop wanting it, because 2 brothers from Uvalde County got to it first. Sample turned that over as he rode. The Cutters were being hunted from behind. They might also be being hunted from the front, which they wouldn't expect, because men who've just done something bad tend to look backward at what they've done, and not forward at what they're riding into. He'd need to find them before the other hunters did. Not out of sentiment. Out of arithmetic. Live men could answer questions. Dead ones were just the end of a story, and Sample was not finished with the story yet. He rode south. The sun came all the way up, and got serious about it, and the country shimmered and burned and was beautiful in the way that hard things sometimes are, completely indifferent to whether you found it beautiful or not. Chapter 3. A fool and his money are soon parted. A fool and his life operate on a similar schedule. Anonymous. Piedras Negras in the summer of 1879 was a town that had grown up the way border towns do, fast, without a plan, in the direction of whatever was profitable that week. It sat on the south bank of the Rio Grande, across from Eagle Pass, and it smelled of the river and charcoal smoke, and the sour undercut of a place where men came to not be found. The buildings on the main street were mostly adobe, with here and there a timber-framed storefront that had arrived with someone's ambition and stayed after the ambition left. The cantinas outnumbered everything else 2-1, which was the town's honest statement of purpose. The Cutter brothers rode in on a Thursday evening, 8 days after the ridge. They'd crossed the Rio Grande at a shallow ford 12 miles east of Eagle Pass, where the water ran knee-deep on the horses, and the current was strong enough to be interesting but not strong enough to be a problem. Dade had crossed first, because Dade always went first at things, and had come out the other side grinning and shaking water off his hat and announcing that Mexico agreed with him. Harlan had crossed in silence and come out the other side and looked back at Texas for a moment before he followed his brother into the scrub. 8 days. In that time, they'd put 160 miles between themselves and the ridge, and Harlan had not slept more than 4 hours on any of those nights, which was not from guilt. He'd examined the question carefully and concluded that guilt was not the operating condition, but from the kind of alertness that sets into a man after he's done something irreversible and knows it. The ridge was behind him. What was ahead of him was everything else, which was a large and unsettled category. Dade had slept fine. They took a room above a cantina on the main street. $2 for the week, a window that looked over the street, and a door that locked with a bar, and not much else to recommend it. The room smelled of the previous occupants, and the plaster walls had names carved in them, and a drawing of something anatomical that Dade studied with professional interest before Harlan threw his bedroll at him and told him to get cleaned up. They ate at a table in the cantina below, beef and beans and tortillas and a bottle of mezcal that Dade ordered, and Harlan left mostly alone. The mezcal was the color of good intentions and tasted like something you'd use to clean a wound. Dade had 3 glasses and opened up the way Dade opened up after 3 glasses of anything, which was like a man who'd been waiting to tell you something since before breakfast. "We need to talk about the letter," Dade said. "Not here," Harlan said. "Nobody in here speaks English." Harlan looked around the cantina. There were 7 other men in the room, and at least 2 of them had the relaxed, comprehensive attention of men who understood more than they were showing. "Some of them speak English, and more of them understand it," he said. "Drink your mezcal." Dade drank his mezcal. He refilled his glass and set the bottle down and leaned back in his chair and put his boots on the edge of the table, which was something Harlan had asked him not to do 3 times in the last week. "We're rich," Dade said, in a lower voice this time at least. "We have $1,100 and a piece of paper we don't know what to do with. The paper's worth $8,000. The paper's worth $8,000 to whoever can cash it," Harlan said. "We don't know if that's us. We don't know what bank takes it. We don't know what name goes on it. A letter of credit isn't money, Dade. It's a promise of money, and a promise from who to who matters." Dade chewed on this. He had the look of a man encountering an inconvenient fact he'd been planning to ignore. "Toll would know," he said. "Toll is in Uvalde, which is in Texas, which is where we just came from. We could write him." Harlan looked at his brother across the table and felt the specific exhaustion that Dade had been producing in him since Dade was old enough to talk. Not a dislike, it wasn't that. More like the feeling of being attached to something that moved at a different speed than you did, and couldn't be convinced otherwise. "We are not going to write a letter to Uvalde about $8,000, Harlan said. "From Mexico. With our names on it." "I wasn't going to use our names." "What names were you going to use?" Dade didn't have an answer ready for that, which was, Harlan had learned, the most reliable indication that Dade hadn't thought a thing through. "Something else," Dade said. "We sit on the letter until we know more," Harlan said. "We keep our heads down, and we don't spend money in a way that gets talked about. We find out what we find out. Then we decide." And if nobody ever figures out what it's worth, then it's still worth nothing, and we're no worse off than before. Dade poured a fourth glass. He looked at it. I didn't come to Mexico to sit quiet, he said. This was not said with anger. It was said with the gravity of a man stating a fundamental truth about himself. I know that, Harlan said. Her name was Rosaria Vila, and she had been working in the Cantina de los Remedios for 4 years, since she was 19. And in that time she had formed opinions about most of the categories of men that pass through Piedras Negras the way water passes through a sluice, under pressure briefly on their way to somewhere else. She had a system of classification that she'd never written down and didn't need to. The men who were running from something versus the men who were running towards something. The men who were dangerous to other men versus the men who were dangerous to women specifically. The men who knew what they were versus the men who only thought they did. The Cutter brothers fell into specific subcategories she had names for. The younger one, Dade, was what she called a rooster. He came in that first night with money he hadn't had long enough to be comfortable with it, and he spent it with the particular carelessness of a man who wants you to see him spending it. He tipped extravagantly and badly, which was how roosters tipped, large at the beginning, before they decided you owed them something. He had quick dark eyes that went to her every time she moved through the room, and he smiled with the full expectation of being smiled back at, which she declined. The older one sat with his back to the wall and watched the door. That was a different category entirely. On the second night, Dade sat at the bar and bought her a drink she didn't want and told her his name, which she already knew. The bartender Eligio had told her the first night, because Eligio made it his business to know the names of men who had come across the river with money and no apparent employment. She listened to Dade talk. He talked the way roosters talk, circling inward, each sentence getting a little closer to the same destination. She let him talk. You learned more from a man talking than from anything else a man did. He told her they'd done something that was going to make them famous. He didn't say what. He let the space around the statement fill with implication, which was almost worse than saying it directly. She looked at his hands while he talked. There was blood worked into the creases of his right knuckle that the river crossing and a week of riding hadn't entirely removed. Not a lot. Enough. Famous how, she said. He grinned. He had a good-looking grin, and he knew it, and used it the way a man uses a tool he's relied on past the point where it should have been replaced. The kind that gets written down, he said. Things that get written down, Rosaria said, usually do. That's what I said. I meant the other kind of written down. She picked up his glass and wiped under it and set it back down. Wanted posters. Inquest reports. Coroner's findings. Dade's grin held but changed quality, the way a fire changes when you put green wood on it. You don't know what we did. No. She looked at his hands again, deliberately so he'd see her looking. But I know what kind of thing it was. He leaned in. This close, she could see that the dark eyes were not quick the way she'd first thought. They were fast. There was a difference. Quick was intelligent. Fast was reactive. You're not scared of me, he said, as if this were a thing that needed correcting. Should I be? Most people are. Most people haven't been working this bar for 4 years, she said. He picked up his glass and thought about that, and either decided it was a compliment or decided he didn't care which it was. He drank. The older one's my brother, he said as if she'd asked. I know. Harlan. He's. Dade turned his glass on the bar. Cautious. He said the word with the tone of a man describing a character flaw in someone he loves. That's the one to listen to, Rosaria said. I always do, Dade said. Eventually. Harlan came to the bar on the third night alone, which surprised her, because the older brother had struck her as a man who went where the need was and not where the pleasure was. He sat in the same stool Dade used and ordered mezcal, and didn't do anything with it except turn the glass on the bar the way Dade had turned his glass on the bar, which was clearly something the Cutter family did when they had something on their minds. He talked too much, Rosaria said. Harlan looked at her. He had a face that had stopped giving things away around the time he decided that the things on his face were nobody else's business. He always talks too much, he said. I'm used to it. Then what? He picked up the mezcal glass and set it down without drinking. Where do you change money here? Paper into coin or paper into different paper? Depends on the paper. Instrument drawn on a Mexico City bank. Rosaria wiped the bar. She did it slowly. That's a specific kind of paper. I know what kind it is. Do you know what name's on it? Harlan said nothing for a moment. Its bearer. She stopped wiping. She looked at him with an attention that she didn't usually give to men at this bar, because men at this bar rarely produced things worth the full attention. A bearer instrument worth $8,000 from a Mexico City bank was not the kind of thing that came through Piedras Negras in the hands of a man who'd crossed the river on horseback. It was the kind of thing that came through in a locked box on an official conveyance. She knew what the locked box on the official conveyance had been, because Eligio had heard the news at the horse market 3 days ago and told her about it the way Eligio told her everything, efficiently, without drama, like a man reading a weather report. 8 dead on a ridge in Uvalde County. I'll ask someone, she said. I'd rather you didn't ask someone, Harlan said. I'd rather you thought about whether you know. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, there's a man in this town who brokers certain kinds of transactions. He doesn't advertise. He works through a notary on the Calle Hidalgo. The notary's name is Fuentes. What's the man's name? I don't know it. I know what he looks like, and I know where to find him, and I know he'll want 40%. 40, Harlan said. For a bearer instrument he didn't earn and can't be connected to, 40% is a modest commission. Harlan thought about it. When could I meet him? I'll send word tomorrow. She picked up the mezcal glass that he'd barely touched and poured it out and put the glass under the bar. And you should know something. Tell me. The man who is coming for you, she said, is not coming for the money. Harlan went still the way he went still when something landed that needed to be looked at directly. What man? I don't know his name either. But I know a man is coming. I know it the way you know a storm is coming. Not because you can see it, but because the air changes. 3 men have asked Eligio about 2 brothers from Texas in the last 2 days. Not the law. Not anyone official. Men who ask questions and don't explain why they're asking. 3 men, Harlan said. 2 together and 1 alone. She let that sit. The 2 together were asking where you were spending money. The 1 alone was asking how you'd come across. Harlan absorbed the distinction. The 2 who wanted to know where the money was going were the kind of men who'd been sent by someone to recover something. The one who wanted to know how they'd cross the river was a different problem. That was a man building a picture. What did Eligio tell them? Eligio told the 2 that he hadn't seen anyone matching that description. She folded the bar rag and set it on the rail. The 1 alone, he told the same thing. But the 1 alone left Eligio $1 and said he'd come back tomorrow. And Eligio took the dollar. Eligio is a practical man, Rosaria said. Harlan put $2 on the bar. So are you. I'm not doing you a favor, she said. I'm telling you what I know, because men who don't know things make a larger mess when it catches up with them, and I work in this room. He picked up his hat. He looked at her with something that might have been respect, if it had been aimed at a person he thought he had the right to respect. Where should we not be? Out of this cantina after dark would be a start, she said. But your brother won't do that. No. Then you have a problem that isn't the man who's coming. He went back upstairs. She watched him go. She thought about the two together, and the one alone, and she thought about the dollar Eligio had taken, and she thought about the way Harlan Cutter had said no about his brother, not in the way of a man dismissing a fact, but in the way of a man confirming one he'd already made his peace with. He knew what his brother was. He'd known it a long time. He'd come to Mexico anyway. That was either love or stupidity, and in her experience the two were often the same animal wearing different clothes. The horse trader's name was Ignacio Peralta, and he had been selling horses in Piedras Negras for 11 years, and had never in those 11 years given a customer a reason to put a hand on him, which was a record he was not going to be able to extend past the following Tuesday. Dade had gone to the horse market on the Calle del Comercio to look at horses, which was not a thing he needed to do, and was a thing Harlan had specifically told him not to do, on the grounds that men who are trying not to be found do not go to the horse market in the town's center and spend 2 hours in animated negotiation with a local trader over a sorrel mare that they did not need and had no place to keep. Peralta's mistake was the one that gets made when a man misjudges the difference between a blusterer and a man with nothing anchoring him. He'd come down $2 on the mare and gone back up 5 cents on the saddle, which was not actually a change in position. It was theater, a small recapture of ground after the concession, the kind of bargaining move that worked on buyers who were counting. Dade was not counting. Dade was watching Peralta's face, and in Peralta's face he saw what he took to be amusement, which was not there, but Dade saw it anyway. He hit Peralta once, open-handed, which spun the man into his own fence post, and then he hit him with the fist on the way back up, which put Peralta on the ground with a broken nose and blood on the dust of the Calle del Comercio. 3 men, who had been watching the negotiation from the shade of a nearby wall, moved back further into the shade and were suddenly interested in other things. Dade looked at Peralta on the ground. He looked at his own hand. He looked at the sorrel mare, who had shied to the end of her tie line, and was watching him with the considered alarm of an animal that has just been given new information. He took his hat off and put it back on, and walked back to the cantina in the full afternoon sun, and went upstairs without stopping at the bar. Harlan was sitting on the edge of the bed, cleaning his pistol, when Dade came in. He looked at his brother's hand, and then at his brother's face, and he set the pistol parts down on the bedroll. Who? Horse trader. He didn't die. I didn't ask if he died. I'm saying he didn't. Is he going to? Dade sat in the chair by the window. No. He's got a broken nose is all. In the middle of the market. He was playing me. They all play you, Harlan said. That's how a market works, Dade. You bargain. You don't? He stopped. He put his hands flat on his knees. Every man in that market saw your face. They'd have seen it anyway. We're living here. There's a difference between being seen and being remembered. Dade looked out the window at the street below. A boy was driving 3 goats past the cantina front, unhurried, and the goats had opinions about the direction. "You worry too much," Dade said. "Somebody in this room has to." Dade turned from the window. He had the post-incident look Harlan knew, the adrenaline settling, the calculation starting up behind the eyes, the belated attempt to measure what it had cost. "We moving?" "Not yet. Moving now draws more attention than staying. We give it 2 days, and we're quiet for 2 days." Harlan picked up the pistol frame and looked at it without seeing it. "And you stay out of the market." "Fine." "And off the street after dark." "Fine." "And away from that woman at the bar." Dade's chin came up. "Rosaria. Whoever she is." "She's smart," Dade said. "I like smart women." "I know you do. That's why I'm telling you to leave her alone. She's smart enough to be a problem." Dade chewed on that. The goat boy and his animals had passed on, and the street below was quiet and white in the afternoon heat. "Harlan," he said after a while. "What?" "Do you ever think about the ridge?" The question dropped into the room and sat there. Harlan finished reassembling the pistol. He seated the cylinder, checked the action, set it on the bedroll. "Sometimes," he said. "Does it bother you?" Harlan thought about what an honest answer to that question looked like. He was not a man who lied to himself as a general practice. He considered it inefficient, like using a dull knife because you didn't want to take the time to sharpen it. "Not the way you mean," he said. "What bothers me is that we did it, and someone knew we would do it. Someone planned on it. We were the instrument of something we don't fully understand yet. That bothers me." Dade was quiet. This was one of the things about Dade that Harlan held onto when everything else was exasperating. The man could be quiet when something was actually worth sitting with. "The letter," Dade said. "The letter. Toll never told us what was in the inner box." "No. He said it was private correspondence. Something a businessman wanted back." Dade turned the word over. "Businessman." "Men who hire the job out," Harlan said, "do not use the word businessman." He looked at the window. "They use whatever word they think you'll find least interesting." Sample crossed the Rio Grande at the same ford the Cutter brothers had used, because the ford had been used by the same quality of men for the same reasons for 50 years, and the bank on each side showed it. He came across in the early morning, 8 days after the brothers, and he crossed slowly because he was looking at the bottom and at the far bank as he went, the way a man enters a room he hasn't been in before. He'd spent 2 days in Eagle Pass before crossing. One of those days, he'd spent talking to a customs agent named Wardlow, who had a gift for remembering faces, and a disinclination to share that gift with anyone who didn't make the conversation worth his while. Sample had made it worth his while to the tune of $4, and the information that 2 men matching the Cutter's description had crossed at the ford 11 miles east, 7 to 8 days prior, with 2 horses, saddlebags, and what Wardlow described as the demeanor of men who had just done something. Wardlow was good at his job. He'd been watching men with that demeanor cross the river for 12 years. The second day, Sample spent at a table in a hotel dining room with a cold coffee going warm in front of him, and a man named Victoriano Garza sitting across from him. Garza was a livestock trader who worked both sides of the river and knew the road between Eagle Pass and Piedras Negras the way a man knows the rooms of his own house, not by looking but by feel. He had a face like a map of somewhere difficult, and eyes that didn't miss much, and had learned not to show that they didn't. Sample laid out what he needed: a name, a location, some indication of how long the brothers had been in Piedras Negras, and whether they'd been noticed. Garza drank his coffee. He looked out the dining room window at the Eagle Pass main street for a while. "Two men like that come into Piedras Negras, they're noticed," he said finally. "Anglos with money and no work. That's a small category, and not a quiet one." "Where do they go?" "The cantinas on the main street. There are 4. The Remedios is the largest." "Anybody in the Remedios I should talk to?" Garza considered. "The bartender, Eligio. He knows what comes through. He'll want something for it." "What else?" "There was an incident at the horse market 2 days ago," Garza said. "A trader named Peralta was assaulted by an Anglo buyer. Broken nose. No charges filed." He spread his hands. "Piedras Negras." "Describe the Anglo." Garza described Dade Cutter with enough accuracy that Sample recognized the description before it was finished. He thanked Garza, paid for the coffees, and went upstairs to his room and looked at his map for a while before he went to sleep. So Dade had hit a horse trader in a public market 2 days ago. The incident at the market meant Dade was restless and spending money and making himself visible, which was useful, and also meant the brothers might move soon. Harlan would know the market incident was a mistake. Harlan would want to relocate. Sample had planned to come at Piedras Negras from the south, where the brothers wouldn't be watching, and he kept that plan. But he moved his timetable up. He came into the edge of Piedras Negras at dusk from the south, which was the direction of scrubland and the camp of the Kickapoo band that had been living in the hills outside the town for 30 years, since the migration south that had taken 1,000 of them across the river to get away from the American government's particular kind of attention. He'd known the Kickapoo camp was there because he'd been in this country before, years ago, and because the camp appeared on no official map, but appeared in the knowledge of every man who had traveled this border country seriously, the way certain truths appear everywhere except in documents. He stopped at the edge of the camp, as he was expected to stop, and waited as he was expected to wait. After a few minutes, a man came out to see him. Old, not elderly. The difference being that old men in this country were old because they'd survived things, which gave the oldness a different quality than it had in other places. He had a face like the limestone, and eyes the color of creek water, and he looked at Sample with the complete assessment of a man who had been reading strangers his entire life and was very good at it. Sample had 2 cigars in his coat pocket, and he produced them and offered one across, which the man accepted. They lit them from Sample's match and smoked for a moment in the cooling evening air. "You're looking for somebody," the man said, in English, which Sample had not expected but didn't show. "2 brothers. Texas men. In town about a week." The man smoked. The camp behind him was quiet, in the way camps are quiet when everyone in them is paying attention to something else. "The one who hurt the horse trader," he said. "The other one, too. The other one is smarter." "I know." The man looked at him with an attention that went past looking at someone and into the category of reading them. "You're not a ranger," he said. "Not a question. Not anymore. But something like it. Something like it." The man nodded, as if this settled something he'd been debating internally. He smoked and looked at the last of the light on the hills to the west. "They were in town yesterday," he said. "The Remedios Cantina. The older one has been asking about a notary on the Calle Hidalgo." Sample went still. The notary on the Calle Hidalgo was not a name he had, but it was a type he recognized. The kind of man who facilitated transactions that needed facilitating without being examined too closely. The letter of credit. Harlan was trying to cash the letter of credit, which meant they were planning to stay a while longer, which was good, and which also meant someone else was probably already aware that an $8,000 bearer instrument had come across the river in the wrong hands, which was less good. Are they still there? As of this morning. The man turned the cigar in his fingers. There were 2 other men in town looking for them 2 days ago. What kind of men? The kind that don't ask, Kickapoo. He said this without particular inflection. They asked at the cantinas and the hotel and the horse market, and then they left. South. Toward Monclova. To report, Sample said. That would be my thought. Sample finished the cigar. He looked at the last light on the hills. The 2 who'd gone south to report were the recovery men, the ones Celestina had warned him about, sent to find the letter of credit and bring back news of it. They'd found the brothers, and now they were going south to tell someone that the brothers were here. That someone would send different men or come themselves, and the time between now and when that happened was the window Sample had to work with. He thanked the man and left $2 at the edge of the camp where the man could take them or not as he chose, and rode into the edge of town from the south in the full dark with the cantina lights ahead of him, and the sound of a guitar coming from somewhere, and the warm night air of the border that smelled of the river and cook fires and everything complicated about a place where one country ended and another one started, and neither of them entirely committed to the claim. He didn't go to the Remedios. Not yet. He found the small hotel on the east end of town and took a room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what he'd have for breakfast, and then went to sleep, which was a skill he'd developed over a long time, the ability to set down a problem at the end of a day without it following him under. Some men couldn't do it. Those men aged quickly. In the morning, he'd find Eligio, the bartender. He'd leave $1 and say he'd be back tomorrow. Then he'd find the notary on the Calle Hidalgo and understand what Harlan Cutter was planning to do with $8,000 that didn't belong to him. And after that, he'd figure out how to be somewhere the brothers didn't expect, before they knew they needed to expect it. He'd done harder things. He tried to think of one, and was asleep before he managed it. Chapter 4. The most dangerous moment in any hunt is the one where the animal figures out it's being hunted. Anonymous. Sample went to the Remedios at 7 in the morning, before the cantina properly opened, and found Eligio sweeping the front step with the mechanical diligence of a man for whom the sweeping was less about the dirt than about having something to do with his hands while he thought. He was a thick man in his 40s, built the way men get built, who have spent decades moving barrels and settling arguments, and he had a broom he used the way a man uses a tool he has a relationship with. He stopped sweeping when Sample came up the step. He did not step back. He looked at Sample the way he had probably looked at every stranger who came at him sideways before the day got started, which was with a patience that had gone all the way through curiosity and come out the other side. "Not open," he said, in English without being asked. "I know," Sample said. "I'm not here for a drink." He put $1 on the step rail where Eligio could see it. "I'm looking for 2 men from Texas. Brothers." Eligio looked at the $1, and then at Sample, and then went back to his sweeping. The broom moved 3 times across the same patch of step. "Lot of men come from Texas," he said. "These 2 have been here about 10 days. The younger one put a horse trader in the street last week." The broom stopped. "Peralta," Eligio said. "That's right." Eligio set the broom against the door frame and picked up the $1 and turned it in his fingers. He was not deciding whether to talk. He had already decided. He was deciding how much the decision was worth and whether the opening dollar represented Sample's floor or his ceiling. He studied Sample's face for about 4 seconds and read it correctly. "They're still here," he said. "Upstairs. Room at the end of the hall. Both of them. The older one went out early this morning. The younger one was still in bed when I came down." "Where does the older one go in the mornings?" "Calle Hidalgo. The notary there. He's been 3 times. Eligio looked at the dollar again, already in his hand. "The notary's name is Fuentes. He is not a man who asks where things come from." "The 2 men who came looking for them before," Sample said. "Describe them." Eligio described 2 men who sounded like hired work, thick through the chest, close-mouthed, the kind of men who come into a cantina and don't drink and don't make conversation and make you wish they'd do one or the other so you could get a handle on them. "Did they say who sent them?" "No. But the one who talked paid for his questions in silver. American silver. He said it the way a professional says something he considers itself an answer." Sample put a second dollar on the rail. "I'll be back this evening." "And if the brothers are gone by evening, then tell me which direction." Eligio picked up the second dollar. "You want me to send word if the older one comes back before then?" "I'm at the Posada Garza on the East End. I know the place." Eligio picked up his broom. He looked like a man who had just concluded a transaction he found unremarkable, which was how you knew he'd done it before. "The younger one," he said, not quite a question. "What about him?" "He's going to do something stupid again before long. He has the look." "I know he does," Sample said. "That's useful." He went back to the east end of town and bought a meal at a cart outside the Posada and ate standing up and watched the Calle Hidalgo from a distance while he did. The street was already busy with the morning commerce of a border town. Carts and mules and a man driving 3 pigs with a stick, and the particular energy of a place that starts its business day before the heat made business a physical argument. He couldn't see the notary's office from here, but he could see the block it was on, and he could see who came and went. At 8:45, Harlan Cutter came up the Calle Hidalgo from the north and turned into a doorway about a third of the way down the block. Sample watched the doorway. He finished his meal. He bought a second coffee from the cart and stood in the shade of a warehouse overhang and drank it and thought about timing. The office of Esteban Fuentes, Notario Publico, was smaller than the brass plate on its door suggested it should be, and smelled of old paper and the particular mustiness that accumulates in rooms where documents outlive the intentions behind them. Fuentes himself was a neat man of 60 with wire spectacles, and the careful movements of someone who had learned that precision was a form of protection. If you did everything correctly and documented it properly, the question of whether it should have been done in the first place became someone else's problem. Harlan had been to see him twice before. The first time was to understand what the letter of credit was and whether it could be converted. The second time was to understand the mechanism and the commission. Today was the third time, and today was supposed to be the day. He sat across the desk from Fuentes and laid the letter of credit on the blotter between them and waited while Fuentes put on his spectacles and read it again with the same careful attention he'd given it on the first 2 visits, as if it might have changed in the interim. "The commission," Harlan said. 35%, Fuentes said. "As agreed." "We agreed on 30. Fuentes looked over his spectacles. "We agreed on 30 contingent on the instrument clearing in 3 days. It has been 4 days since our first conversation, and certain complications have presented themselves." "What complications?" Fuentes took off his spectacles and polished them with a cloth from his desk drawer, which was the kind of action a man takes when he wants a moment before he says something. The bank in Mexico City that issued this instrument, he said, has been contacted by another party, inquiring about a lost or stolen letter of credit of this denomination. The inquiry was made 4 days ago. Harlan kept his face where it was. Which means the instrument has been reported. Which means any bank asked to honor it will report the transaction before completing it. Which means the 35% I am now requesting reflects the additional risk of completing a transaction that has become. Fuentes replaced his spectacles and looked at the letter on the blotter. Visible. Who made the inquiry to the bank? I don't know. Take a guess. Fuentes laced his fingers on the desk. He had the look of a man who had taken very few guesses in his professional life and was not about to start now. The original consignee, he said carefully. Or someone acting for them. Harlan sat with that. The original consignee was whoever had sent the letter of credit on the stage in the first place, which meant whoever had arranged the robbery was not, after all, the person the letter was going to. Which meant the man who'd hired Toll to hire the Cutters had stolen from someone else first, and that someone else was now making inquiries. There were 2 parties chasing this letter of credit, and neither of them was Harlan Cutter, and Harlan Cutter was sitting in the middle of it holding the paper. He thought about what Rosaria had said. The man coming for you is not coming for the money. He'd understood her to mean the man was coming for him specifically, a lawman, a bounty hunter. But there were also men coming for the money, and they were coming from the south, and they were a different problem. Can you complete the transaction in the next 48 hours? Fuentes considered. For 40%, I can have coin in your hand by tomorrow afternoon. 40% of 8,000 is 3,200, Harlan said. I'm carrying 1,100 in cash. If I walk out of here with $4,800, I'm a considerably different kind of problem for whoever is looking for me than if I walk out with 11. That, Fuentes said, is entirely your calculation to make, mister. He let the blank where Harlan's name should have been hang in the air between them like smoke. Harlan looked at the letter of credit on the blotter. He'd thought about it for 10 days. He'd carried it across the river and across 160 miles of brush country and kept it in his boot and taken it out at night and looked at it in the lamplight the way men look at things they know are dangerous and can't put down. Tomorrow afternoon, he said. 40%. Coin only. Fuentes picked up the letter and slid it into a leather folio on the side of his desk. The transaction, such as it was, had been concluded. Come at 3 o'clock, he said. And come alone. He walked back to the cantina in the growing heat of the morning with the particular feeling of a man who has just made a decision that is simultaneously the right decision and a decision that is going to produce consequences. He'd learned to tolerate that feeling. It was the feeling of being in motion, which was better than the alternative. He watched Harlan go back up the Calle Hidalgo and tracked him by hat and shoulder through the street traffic until he turned north toward the main street, which was toward the Remedios Cantina. Sample gave him 10 minutes and then crossed the street and went down the Calle Hidalgo to the notary's door. The conversation with Fuentes cost him $5 and took 12 minutes. Fuentes was a man who dealt in information the same way he dealt in documents, precisely without sentiment, at a price that reflected the risk of producing it. The risk here was not large from Fuentes' perspective. He was telling a stranger about a transaction, not about a man's location. Sample let him make that distinction. He learned 3 things. The letter of credit was real, and was now in Fuentes' possession. Harlan Cutter would come back for it tomorrow at 3 o'clock. And the instrument had been reported stolen to the issuing bank in Mexico City 4 days ago by a party Fuentes declined to identify, but whose representative, he confirmed, had also visited Piedras Negras recently. The two men who'd gone south to Monclova had not gone south to report. They'd gone south to the nearest telegraph office, filed the report to Mexico City, and come back. They were still in the area. Sample thanked Fuentes and walked back out into the heat and stood on the Calle Hidalgo and thought about the shape of the next 24 hours. He had options, and he ranked them the way he ranked all options, by what each one committed him to and what it cost in terms of the things he still didn't know. He could take the brothers tonight, in the room above the cantina. Direct, low risk, resolved. But the letter of credit would be in Fuentes' office, and Fuentes would hand it to whoever came next with a plausible claim. And the man with the silver ring in San Antonio would have his instrument back with nothing connecting him to 8 bodies on a limestone ridge. He could wait until 3 o'clock tomorrow, take Harlan at the notary's office with the coin in hand, and use Harlan to reach the broker toll in Uvalde and from toll reach Burgess. But that left Dade loose in Piedras Negras for another 24 hours, which was approximately 23 hours longer than Dade should be left loose anywhere. The third option was the one he settled on. The one that was not a solution, but a lever. You didn't always need to solve a problem to move it in the direction you wanted it to go. Sometimes you just needed to change what the problem knew about itself. He went back to the Posada Garza and got his saddlebag and paid his bill. He collected the blood bay from the livery at the east end of town and rode north out of Piedras Negras along the riverbank road for about a mile, and then cut west into the scrubland that backed up against the edge of town. The ground here was mesquite and caliche and the occasional dry creek bed, and it was the kind of ground that people who lived in towns did not walk in at night, which suited him. He found the camp by smell before he found it by sight, the remnants of a cook fire, the particular scent of horses and men who had been in the same place for more than a few days. He came at it from upwind and on foot, the blood bay tied at a mesquite 150 yards back, and he lay in the scrub at the edge of the firelight and counted. 2 men. The same 2 Eligio had described, thick, close mouth, the kind of work that came in pairs. They had a small fire going, despite the heat, because the alternative was the dark, and men who camp alone in foreign scrubland tend to vote for the fire regardless of the temperature. They had good horses on a picket line, and a camp that was organized but not comfortable, which told him they'd been here longer than they'd expected to be, and had not entirely made their peace with it. They were watching the town from the north, waiting for an instruction from Monclova that hadn't come yet or had told them to hold. He lay in the scrub and watched them for 40 minutes and learned what he needed to learn about their habits and their sight lines and which one kept watch and which one slept, and then he withdrew the way he'd come and went back to his horse. He had one thing in his coat pocket that he'd carried for 8 years without using it for anything except remembering. He took it out and turned it in his palm. A ranger's sergeant badge, the old 5-point star, silver that had gone dark in the creases and bright on the points. The star from a job he'd lost through an act of principle that had cost him more than the job and less than his self-regard. He'd kept it because he'd earned it, and because throwing it away would have been a kind of lie about what the 19 years had meant. He rode back toward the edge of Piedras Negras in the dark, staying in the scrub, and he came around to the south side of the Remedios Cantina, where a narrow dirt passage ran between the back of the building and the wall of the property behind it. He went into the passage on foot and picked his way through the dark to a point below the window of the room Eligio had described, end of the hall, north-facing. He could hear the sound of someone inside moving, then the creak of a bed frame. He crouched in the passage dirt. He pressed the badge into the soil with his boot heel, deliberately, point down, until the star shape was clean and clear in the soft ground. He looked at it. Then he stood and went back down the passage and out to the street and rode north out of town without hurrying. He made his camp 3 miles out in the scrubland, no fire, and lay on his bedroll under more stars than a man ever needed, and listened to the desert make its nighttime accommodations with itself. By morning, Harlan would find the badge. He might find it before, if one of them went into the passage in the night, which was possible. The badge itself told them nothing specific. It was a ranger's star, and it was pressed into the dirt below their window, and it meant one thing only: someone had been outside in the dark and had wanted them to know it. What it did to Harlan was what interested Sample. Harlan would understand the message. Harlan would begin to think about who sent it, and how close they were, and what they knew. Harlan would start moving the problem around inside his head, the way you move furniture when you're trying to figure out which door it came through. And Dade would say, it was nothing. That conversation between them was the lever. Sample intended to be in a position to watch it from close enough to read the outcome. Dade found it at first light when he went out the back to use the alley. He almost stepped on it. He looked down at the last moment, not instinct, just his boot catching the edge of the shape in the dirt, the way your eye catches a thing that doesn't belong in the geometry of a place. And he stopped and looked at the star pressed into the soil below their window, and felt something he would not later admit to feeling, which was a sudden, full-body attention of the kind his nervous system reserved for information that changed the landscape. He looked up and down the passage. Empty. He looked at the window above him. He went back inside and up the stairs and shook Harlan by the shoulder, which was a thing he almost never did, because Harlan's method of waking from sleep was one of the few things about his brother that genuinely put Dade at a physical disadvantage. Harlan came awake with his hand on the gun before his eyes fully opened, which was not unusual for a man who'd spent the last 3 weeks on the run, and the last several years before that in work that had trained his body to treat sleep as a position you could be attacked from. "Passage," Dade said. "Come look." They went down together and through the back and into the passage. Harlan crouched over the badge and looked at it without touching it. He looked at the impression. The boot heel that had made it was a size 10 or 11, the strike deliberate. Not a man who'd stepped on something by accident, but a man who'd pressed a specific object into a specific spot with the clear intention of having it found. He picked the badge up and turned it over. No inscription on the back. The front had the Texas Ranger designation, worn down to suggestion on the lower 2 points, but legible on the upper 3. He held it for a long moment. "Ranger," Dade said. "Ex-Ranger." "How do you know X?" "Because an active Ranger comes at you with a warrant, and other Rangers." Harlan turned the badge again. "This is a man telling us he was here. In the dark. Below our window. He could have come in, and he didn't, which means he doesn't want us yet." Dade looked at the passage, and at the blank back wall of the cantina, and at the window above. The morning light was coming in gray, at the south end of the passage, thin and not yet warm. "Bounty hunter," he said. "Most likely." "For the stage." "For the stage." Dade absorbed this with the expression of a man recalibrating an arithmetic he'd considered settled. "Well," he said after a moment, "we knew someone would come eventually." "We knew someone would come eventually," Harlan said. "I did not know someone would come to the alley behind our room, in the dark, and leave his credentials in the dirt to let us know he'd been there. That's a different kind of someone." The distinction sat between them in the passage. "He wants us scared," Dade said. "He wants us moving," Harlan said. "Scare is a side effect." He put the badge in his coat pocket. "If he wanted us scared, he'd have done it differently. He wants us to make a decision in a hurry, and he wants to watch which decision we make. Then we don't move. We can't not move. The two men who came looking for us went south, and they're coming back with something worse. The letter of credit is in Fuente's office, and I pick it up at 3 o'clock today. We get the coin, we go north across the river, and we put 100 miles between ourselves and Piedras Negras. North is Texas. North is 50,000 square miles of Texas," Harlan said, "one of which has a bounty hunter in it." Dade looked at the impression in the dirt where the badge had been. "I want to know who he is. We find out after we're across the river. And if he follows us across, then we deal with him on ground we know better than he does." Harlan turned and went back inside. He said the next thing over his shoulder without stopping. "Pack what you need. Leave the rest." He was north of town in the mesquite before they woke up, positioned on a low caliche rise that gave him sightlines to the main street, the North Road, and the riverbank track. He had a pair of field glasses that he used for 10 minutes and then set aside. The glasses gave you detail, but they narrowed your field, and narrow fields got men killed in open country. He preferred the wide view and patience. He watched the remedios for movement. At 6:40, he saw Dade come out the front of the cantina and look up and down the main street. Not with the loose curiosity of a man going out for morning air. With the compressed attention of a man who has just learned something, he needs to see the outside world through a different lens. Dade stood on the step for a full minute and then went back inside. Harlan came out 20 minutes later, alone, and walked directly to the Calle Hidalgo. He moved the way he always moved, no haste, no performance, but his route was different from the previous mornings. He came at the Calle Hidalgo from the west side, instead of the north, which added 4 minutes to the walk, and allowed him to cross a street corner from which he could see 3 directions at once for about 2 seconds. A man checking his surroundings in a way that looked like nothing. Sample noted the route change and noted what it meant and went back to his wide view. The badge had worked. Not in the way that scaring someone works, where you put a thing in motion you can't control. In the way that information works, it changed the shape of the problem for the men who had it, and the shape it changed into was the shape Sample had intended. They would move today. They would go north. They would try to cross the river before dark, which put them on Texas ground before the recovery men from the south could come back through. And it put them on Texas ground where Sample could pick his moment. Mexico had been theirs. Texas was his. He waited. At 2:15, Harlan came back down the Calle Hidalgo, and Sample watched him through the glasses long enough to see what he was carrying, which was a canvas bag with the weight of coin in it, hanging slightly off vertical. The transaction at Fuente's had gone through. 40% to the notary, which left $4,800 in coin, which was enough money to change the brothers' options considerably, and also enough money to make every bad decision they'd already made feel justified, which was its own kind of danger. At 3 o'clock, both brothers came out of the remedios with their saddlebags and went to the livery on the south end of the main street. Sample was already moving. The road north from Piedras Negras ran through 6 miles of brush country before it reached the ford. The brush was mesquite and huisache and the occasional twisted live oak, and it pushed in close on both sides of the road for the first 2 miles and then opened into scrubland where you could see a long way in every direction. The brothers would be most alert in the open country. The compressed section near town was the place to work. There was a ravine 2.5 miles out, where a dry creek cut under the road through a limestone shelf. The crossing was 8 feet wide, and the banks on either side were 4 feet high, and the bottom was dry caliche hardpan. A man on horseback went through it single file because the crossing was too narrow for 2 abreast, which meant for the 3 seconds of the crossing, the brothers were separated by the length of a horse. Sample was in the ravine bottom when they came through. He'd gone cross-country from his rise north of town, pushing the blood bay hard through the brush, and come at the ravine from the east with 12 minutes to spare. He tied the horse 50 yards east in the scrub and come back on foot, and gone down into the ravine bottom, and settled himself against the north bank where the overhang of limestone shelf above the road gave him shade and cover. He'd thought about the geometry for the 12 minutes he'd had, and liked what he thought about. He heard them coming before he saw them. 2 horses at a road trot, the sounds of men who are moving with purpose and not talking, which was a change from what he'd have expected from Dade. The badge had done something to the dynamic between them, redistributed the weight. Harlan was in front. He always was, but there was something different about it now. The lead horse, Harlan's, came down the bank into the ravine crossing, and Sample let it pass. The second horse followed into the crossing, and Sample came off the north bank shelf above the road, and dropped onto Dade from behind. It was not elegant. It didn't need to be. Dade came out of the saddle, and the horse shied right, and Sample came down on top of Dade's back in the crossing, and drove his face into the caliche hardpan with enough force to take the fight out of the situation immediately. His knee went into the back of Dade's right arm, and he had the left arm behind the back before Dade had understood what had happened. The whole thing took about 4 seconds. Harlan pulled up ahead and spun his horse and had the gun out, and Sample was already behind Dade's body with his own gun pressed to the back of Dade's neck, both of them in the ravine bottom, Dade's face in the dirt and blood from his nose starting to darken the caliche. "Harlan," Sample said. It was the first time he'd said Harlan's name out loud, which was interesting. It landed on the man the way a name does when it comes from a stranger who has no business knowing it, like a hand on the shoulder from behind. Harlan held his gun level. He was 15 feet away, and the angle was bad, Dade between them, Sample below grade. He had the stillness he always had, but it was a different quality of stillness now. Not the kind that preceded patience, but the kind that preceded a calculation. "Who are you?" Harlan said. "Eldridge Sample. I was a sergeant in Captain Hollis's company, out of San Antonio, until 1876. I'm currently contracted by Wells Fargo to locate and return you and your brother for the matter of the Medina Ridge stage robbery and the deaths of 8 people on that ridge." He said it the way you'd read a document. "Put the gun down, Harlan. You put yours down. Mine is touching the back of your brother's neck." Dade made a sound that was not a word. "I know," Sample said to him without looking away from Harlan. "Hold still." Harlan looked at his brother's face in the caliche, and at Sample behind him, and at his own gun, and did the arithmetic. It came out the same way Birch's arithmetic had come out on the stage, which gave Harlan a feeling he did not spend time looking at directly. He lowered the gun. He did not put it away. He lowered it to the saddle horn and left it there. "Step down," Sample said. Harlan stepped down. He kept his hand near the gun on the horn, but not on it, which was the right choice, the choice of a man who understood the geometry of the moment without having been told it. Sample took Dade's gun, put it in his belt, and got off Dade's back and pulled him up to his knees by the collar. Dade's nose was broken. He had caliche dust in his hair and on his face, and the blood had gone across his mouth and chin, and he looked more surprised than anything else, which was a thing Sample had observed about violent men. They expected it from each other and not from the ground. "I want to know about Toll," Sample said. He was looking at Harlan. "We're not telling you anything," Dade said thickly through the blood. "I'm not asking you," Sample said. Harlan looked at him. He looked at his brother. He looked at the road north toward the ford, and Texas and the country beyond it that had lately been full of possibility and was now full of something else. "Cephas Toll," he said. "Livestock brokerage in Uvalde. He brought us the job. Said it was from a businessman who needed certain property recovered." "Did Toll give you a name?" "No name." "A description?" "Anglo, middle-aged, operated out of San Antonio." "Anything else?" Harlan's jaw moved. He was weighing what the information cost against what withholding it cost, which was not a simple calculation when the man you were calculating against was holding your brother by the collar in a dry creek bed with a gun touching his neck. "Toll said the man had connections to the Rangers," Harlan said. "Current Rangers. That's why the previous inquiry into our business got shut down in Uvalde. The man told Toll to tell us that, as a guarantee. Proof he had reach." Sample absorbed this. It confirmed Celestina's warning. It confirmed what the silence in Hollis's file had suggested. It put a shape on Burgess that was beginning to look less like a shadow and more like a man. He looked at Dade on his knees in the crossing. He looked at the canvas bag with the coin in it on Harlan's saddle. He looked at Harlan. "Here's what happens," he said. "Your brother is going to sit here." He produced a length of cord from his coat and tied Dade's hands behind him, which Dade accepted with a quality of furious stillness that was a considerable departure from his usual manner. Sample tied the other end to the base of a live oak root that had come through the ravine wall, solid, low, impossible to stand up from. "He's not going anywhere, and he's not in danger. You and I are going to ride north, and you're going to tell me everything about how Toll found you, and what the arrangement looked like, and whether you ever met the man behind it. When we're across the river, I'll send word back to Eligio at the Remedios about where your brother is. Eligio will send someone to cut him loose." Harlan looked at his brother. Dade was looking at the root his wrists were tied to, with an expression of pure and focused resentment. "And then what?" Harlan said. "And then you and I finish a conversation that I've been having in my head since San Antonio. About the ridge. About the ridge. And about the man who arranged it. And about what's going to happen when we get back to Texas." Harlan looked at Sample with the concentrated assessment of a man trying to find the angle in an offer and not finding it. "You could take us both in right now." "I could." "Why don't you?" Sample picked up Dade's hat from the ravine floor and set it on Dade's head, an act of such particular deliberateness that Dade went still trying to understand what it meant. Sample looked at Harlan. "Because dead men answer the one question and no others," Sample said. "And I have more than one question." Harlan stood in the ravine crossing, with the afternoon light coming down into it yellow and hard, and the sound of his brother's breathing, and the distant complaint of a bird in the mesquite. He looked at the note Sample held out to him, Eligio's name on it, and the location of the ravine written in a plain, clear hand, prepared in advance. He took it. "You knew," Harlan said. "You knew we'd go north today." "I knew you'd go north today," Sample said. "As soon as you found the badge." Harlan turned that over. The badge had not been a warning. It had been a herding instrument. He'd understood that in the passage this morning, and had gone north anyway, because north was the right move regardless, and Sample had known he'd understand it that way and go north anyway. The man had been 3 steps ahead at every point and had not needed to hurry once. "Dade," Harlan said. "Harlan." Dade's voice was thick with the broken nose but level under it, which was one of the true things about Dade Cutter. When it came to it, past the grin and the mezcal and the horse traders, he was level. "Sit tight." "I know how to sit," Dade said. "Go." Harlan remounted. He looked at Sample on the blood bay with his gun holstered and his hands easy on the reins, as if the last 10 minutes had been a routine piece of business. Harlan had met men who were dangerous in his life, had been dangerous himself in his own assessment, and he understood now, in the ravine with the caliche dust still settling and his brother's blood on the hardpan, that the categories he'd been working with were not the right categories. This was something else. They rode north out of the ravine into the white afternoon, toward the river, toward Texas, toward whatever Sample had decided was going to happen next. Behind them in the ravine, Dade Cutter tested the cord once, found it sound, and sat back against the root and watched a hawk work the thermals above the mesquite, and thought about the man named Eldridge Sample, and the note in Harlan's hand, and the 3 words on it that were his brother's location, and felt, for the first time in his life, something he had no word for, but which sat in his chest like a stone and did not move. Chapter 5. The reckoning is not the end of the story. It is only the part the story was building toward. Anonymous. The road from the ravine to the ford ran through 5 miles of mesquite brush, and then opened into the flat, pale scrubland that preceded the river, and they rode it in a silence that was not uncomfortable so much as deliberate, the silence of 2 men who understood they were not yet at the part of the conversation that mattered. Sample let it sit. He had found, over a long career of getting information out of men who did not want to give it, that the most reliable technique was patience, and the second most reliable technique was giving the man a problem to solve instead of a question to answer. The problem he'd given Harlan was simple. Dade was in a ravine in Mexico with a broken nose and a cord around his wrists, and the only person who could do anything about that was the man riding next to Eldridge Sample. That problem had a shape and a weight, and Harlan was carrying it. Sample was content to let him carry it, until the carrying became the conversation. It took about 2 miles. "Toll came to us in March," Harlan said. He said it without preamble, the way a man resumes something he'd been thinking through. "Came to our place outside Uvalde. Said he had work that matched our particular skills," which was a way of saying he knew about the freight wagon job in '77 and had decided that made us qualified. "It didn't make you qualified," Sample said. "It made you findable." Harlan looked at him sideways, took the distinction, and filed it. He said the principal wanted a specific item recovered from a Wells Fargo shipment. A document. He didn't say what kind. He said the principals were men of consequence who preferred not to appear in the transaction directly, and that there'd be a finder's commission when we delivered the item to a location in Laredo. What location in Laredo? A hotel. The Cosmopolitan. We were to ask for a room registered to a Mr. Aldridge. Sample put that away. And the 8 people on the ridge. Harlan looked at the road ahead. The scrubland ran out flat and thorn gray toward the river line, which was a smear of darker green on the horizon. Toll said the stage carried a guard and a driver. He said the passengers were a complication we'd need to manage. "Manage," Sample said. That was the word. And you understood what it meant. Harlan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the flatness of a man making a statement he has already judged himself for, and found the judgment insufficient and moved past it. "I understood what it meant." Sample let that land and settle, and become part of the road behind them. He didn't say anything about it. There was nothing to say about it, that the 8 bodies on the Medina Ridge hadn't already said more clearly. Did Toll ever mention the man by name? Not his name. But he let things slip the way men do when they want you to know they're working for someone important without being specific about it. He mentioned Captain Hollis twice. Not as a threat. As a reference. The way you'd mention someone's employer to establish that the person you're working for has standing. Sample's hand stayed easy on the reins. The blood bay flicked an ear at something in the brush and walked on. Did Toll say Hollis was involved? He said, Harlan thought back carefully, the way a man does when he understands the exactness of words matters now in a way it didn't before. He said the principal had the trust of men in high places, and Captain Hollis was a man who knew the principal personally. He said it like he was citing a character reference. The river came up ahead of them, and the ford glittered in the angled afternoon light. The water was low for June. Drought pushing south from the Llano Estacado had pulled the tributaries down, and the crossing was wide and shallow and unremarkable. They went into it side by side, and the horses drank without being asked to stop, and the water ran clear over the limestone bottom. Texas on the north bank looked exactly like Mexico on the south bank, which was something the line on the map hadn't figured out how to resolve, and probably never would. Hollis was my captain, Sample said when they were on the north bank. He said it the way you say a fact you've carried long enough that it no longer had much weight, just presence. Harlan looked at him. I know. How? Rosaria told me someone was coming who wasn't coming for the money. Eligio told me a man had been asking questions in a way that wasn't the law, but was something like it. Between those two things and the badge in the passage, he stopped. Ex-Ranger. The right age. Working contract for Wells Fargo instead of the state. The disagreement with Hollis in '76 is a thing people in Uvalde County know about, Mr. Sample, because Hollis made sure it was known. I expect he did, Sample said. He's the one, Harlan said. Not a question. Stating it so Sample could confirm or not. Sample looked at the road north. The country was brush and caliche, and the occasional live oak, and it went on in that manner for a long way. Cephas Toll's initials are CT, he said. The man who sent the telegram from the Southern Pacific Freight Office in San Antonio signed himself Burgess. He wore a plain silver ring on his right hand and walked east toward the river when he left. Hollis's full name is Carter Hollis Burgess. He paused. He uses the middle name professionally. As a captain, he was Hollis. As a private citizen with a land company and a letter of credit and 8 people on a ridge, he was Burgess. Harlan absorbed this without expression. Then, the letter of credit. The land company Fuentes mentioned, that was Hollis stealing from the consignee. Hollis intercepted a negotiable instrument belonging to a land syndicate operating out of Austin, Sample said. Then hired you to steal it off the stage for him. He's got 2 sets of enemies now. The syndicate looking to recover $8,000 and me looking to put 8 bodies on a ridge in front of a jury. Which one worries him more? The syndicate has lawyers, Sample said. I'm the other kind of problem. They rode on. The sun was getting into the lower third of the sky and throwing long shadows east. A scissortail sat on a fence post and watched them pass with the alert indifference of a bird that has seen stranger things on this road and will likely see stranger things again. Eligio's man was a boy of 17 named Tomas who knew the ravine road because he'd been fishing the creek below it since he was 8, and who arrived at the ravine crossing 2 hours after Sample and Harlan had ridden north to find Dade Cutter sitting against the root with his eyes closed and his head back and his broken nose pointing at the sky. Tomas had a knife, and used it on the cord and stepped back, which was the right instinct. Dade opened his eyes. He looked at the boy, and at the knife, and at the root he'd been tied to for 2 hours in the afternoon heat of a Mexican ravine. He stood up slowly, the way men stand when they've been stationary long enough for the body to register a complaint about it. He worked his hands. He picked his hat up from the dirt, because Sample had set it on his head, and it had fallen off when he'd shifted against the root, and he put it back on. My horse. Tomas pointed south. The horse was still on the tie line Sample had put it on, 50 yards down the ravine, cropping at a thin patch of grass in the caliche with the focused contentment of an animal that has decided not to be troubled by the recent events. Dade retrieved the horse, checked the saddlebags. Everything there. His gun was gone. Sample had taken it in the ravine and not returned it, which was not a surprise and was not the immediate problem. He swung up. North? He said to the boy. See. The ford. He rode north, and he rode hard, not from panic, but from a focused and somewhat frightening clarity that the broken nose and the 2 hours in the ravine had produced in him. He'd had time to think. Dade Cutter rarely had enforced time to think, and when it was given to him, the results were sometimes surprising even to himself. He'd thought about the stone in his chest and what it meant. He'd thought about the man Sample, the way Sample had dropped off the bank above the road and taken him in 4 seconds and then put the hat on his head after, which was the part he kept returning to. You didn't put a man's hat on his head after you'd put his face in the dirt, unless you were making a point about the hat being incidental. Unless what you were doing was returning a man's dignity along with his headwear, which was something Dade had never encountered before and wasn't sure he had a category for. He thought about the ridge. He told Harlan it didn't bother him, and he'd believed it at the time, and he'd believed it in the cantina and in the room above the remedios with the names carved in the walls and the bottle of mezcal and all the days in between. What he'd discovered in the ravine with 2 hours and nothing else to think about was that didn't bother was not the same as was not there. The ridge was there. It had been there every day. He'd just been moving fast enough not to stand still in front of it. He crossed the river at the ford and came up on the north bank and followed the road and found them 3 miles on, sitting their horses in the shade of a stand of live oaks at the edge of a dry creek crossing. Sample was watching the road south. Harlan had his hat off and was using it as a fan, which was a thing Harlan did when he was working through something. Dade pulled up alongside Harlan. He looked at Sample, who looked back at him with the level attention of a man who has neither surprise nor relief to spare for the moment. Your nose, Harlan said. I know. Dade touched it and winced and took his hand away. Where are we going? Harlan looked at Sample. Sample looked at the road ahead. Kinney County, Sample said. I want to talk to a man in Brackettville before we go to Uvalde. He said it the way you say a thing that is not a request. And I want toll in Uvalde before we go to San Antonio. And in San Antonio, Dade said. In San Antonio, Sample said. There is a man who arranged for 8 people to die on a limestone ridge so he could steal a piece of paper. That man is currently under the impression that his name is not attached to that event. I intend to correct the impression. The live oaks moved in a wind that had come up from the south, off the river, smelling of mud and distance. Dade looked at his brother, and Harlan looked at him, and something passed between them that had the texture of a question being answered without being asked. We're going with you, Dade said. Not a question, and not quite a statement. Something in between. You're going ahead of me, Sample said. In the sense that I have a rope, and I know how to use it on a saddle horn. He said this without heat. But yes. "You're going to San Antonio." Dade looked at the rope on Sample's saddle. He looked at Sample. He nodded once, a single definitive motion, and put his heels to the horse. The man who ran the land office in Brackettville was named Terrell, and he'd been running it for 11 years, and in that time had developed the professional caution of a man who understood that land records were the kind of thing that people sometimes came to inquire about for reasons that were not straightforwardly about land. He received Sample in the late afternoon of the following day, and he answered Sample's questions about the Austin Land Company with the measured cooperation of a man who has been told by a Wells Fargo agent in writing that this inquiry has legal standing. The land company had filed deed transfers in Kinney County 8 months ago. 14 parcels along the Nueces River drainage, purchased under the company name from individual ranchers who had in several cases expressed to the county clerk that they had not been aware they were selling. The company representative who appeared on the transfer documents was listed as a C.H. Burgess agent. The same C.H. Burgess had appeared on a mineral rights filing in Uvalde County 6 months prior, and on a grazing lease application in Uvalde County the year before that, and on 2 water rights transfers in Kinney County in 1877. Sample sat in Terrell's office and worked through the documents while the afternoon heat pressed on the roof, and the Cutter brothers waited outside on the step, which was where Sample had left them with the suggestion that they not go anywhere, and the rope visible on his saddle as a supplement to the suggestion. When he had what he needed, he thanked Terrell and went back out. The brothers were where he'd left them. Harlan was sitting on the step, working a stone out of his boot. Dade was standing in the street, watching a dog investigate a horse trough with forensic thoroughness. "He's been building since '77, Sample said. "Land, water rights, mineral claims. All of it under the Burgess name. Using the captain's salary and the ranger connections to quiet any inquiry, and using the land company to hold the assets." He put the notes he'd made in his coat. The Austin Syndicate's letter of credit was the next piece. $8,000 into the Burgess accounts would have cleared the last of the debt on the Nueces parcels. Instead, it went to a notary in Piedras Negras, Dade said. 40% to the notary, Harlan said. "And the other 60 in your saddlebag," Sample said. He looked at Harlan. "Which becomes evidence." Harlan had been waiting for this. "You're taking the coin." "I'm taking it back to Pruitt at Wells Fargo, who will return it to the Austin Syndicate, who will have the paperwork they need to file against Hollis for the original theft of the instrument." He paused. "That part is the lawyer's problem. My problem is the 8 people on the ridge." Dade looked at the dog at the trough. The dog had resolved whatever question it had about the trough and was moving on. "And our problem," Dade said. "Your problem and my problem have the same address," Sample said. "San Antonio." After that, they diverge. They came into the edge of San Antonio on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days out of Brackettville, having stopped in Uvalde long enough for Sample to spend 45 minutes with Cephas Toll in the back room of the livestock brokerage. Toll was a compact, sweating man who had spent the last 3 weeks telling himself the Cutter brothers were safely in Mexico, and the whole business was concluded. And the sight of Sample and the Cutters walking through his door had the effect on him of a man who has been carrying a weight he didn't know he was carrying, until it was suddenly made much heavier. He told Sample what he knew. He told him quickly and completely, in the manner of a man who has done the arithmetic on his situation and found the arithmetic emphatic. He confirmed Hollis. He confirmed the Cosmopolitan Hotel in Laredo as the delivery point. He confirmed that Hollis had told him, after the ridge, to stop worrying about the matter and let it resolve itself, which was the kind of instruction that told you everything about what a man thought you were worth. Sample wrote down what Toll said and had him sign it, and left him with the understanding that the signed statement would be in the hands of the Bexar County District Attorney within the week, and that Toll's cooperation would be noted. He did not tell Toll that cooperation did not constitute immunity, and he did not tell Toll it didn't, because that was the district attorney's determination to make and not his. They came into San Antonio on the Commerce Street Road, and Sample left the Cutters at the Bexar County Sheriff's Office with a sealed letter he'd written at the Brackettville Land Office, and a deputy named Hicks who had the useful quality of doing what he was told without requiring an explanation of why. The letter was addressed to the sheriff and contained a summary of the matter, including the toll statement and the land office records, and a request that the brothers be held pending the outcome of the inquiry into Carter Hollis Burgess, which was a matter that would require the district attorney and probably a judge. Dade went into custody without resistance. Harlan stopped in the doorway of the sheriff's office and looked back at Sample. "The man," Harlan said. "Hollis. You're going to him now." "I am." "You should know," Harlan started, and then reconsidered how to put it. "He's not the kind of man who comes to the door alone." Sample looked at him. "I know what kind of man he is." He said it without inflection or emphasis, the way you describe the weather. "I worked for him for 4 years." Harlan held his gaze for a moment. There was something in Harlan's face that was not quite respect and not quite pity, and occupied a narrow position between the two. He went inside. Carter Hollis Burgess kept an office on St. Mary's Street, 2nd floor, his name on the door in gold leaf that had started to peel at the lower right corner. The office had the look of a room that someone had furnished to communicate success, and that had not been updated since the success began to feel less secure. There was a ranger's commission on the wall in a frame, and a map of Texas with certain parcels marked in red pencil, and a desk that was large enough to serve as a statement of intent. Hollis was behind it when Sample came through the door, and he was not alone. There was a man to the left of the door who had been a ranger once and whose name Sample knew, and a man standing at the window who Sample didn't recognize but whose posture communicated his function clearly enough. Hollis had aged since 1876, the way men age when they've been carrying something they can't put down. He was 54 now, thick through the middle in a way that the captain's uniform had previously disguised, with gray in his hair and the eyes that Sample remembered, flat and attentive and capable of warmth as a performance. He was wearing a plain silver ring on his right hand. He looked at Sample for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Eldridge," as if they'd run into each other at a hardware store. "Captain." "I'm not a captain anymore." "No," Sample said. "You're not." He looked at the man to his left and at the man at the window. Neither of them had moved. "I've got Harlan and Dade Cutter in the Bexar County Sheriff's Office with a letter explaining the Medina Ridge matter. I've got a signed statement from Cephas Toll in Uvalde connecting the arrangement to a C.H. Burgess of San Antonio. I've got land office records from Kinney, Valverde, and Uvalde counties showing the same C.H. Burgess has been building a land portfolio using a name the Rangers don't have in their personnel files." He paused. "And I've got the $4,800 from the letter of credit, which I'm returning to Pruitt at Wells Fargo this afternoon." Hollis listened to this with his hands flat on the desk. He had the stillness of a man who had spent his career in rooms where losing your composure was the worst thing you could do. And the composure was good, but it was the kind of good that costs something to maintain, and Sample could see the cost. "That's a considerable collection of documents," Hollis said. For a man working a bounty contract. I branched out. Eldridge. Hollis leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into the register Sample recognized from a dozen late-night conversations in a dozen ranger camps, the voice that meant he was about to offer something. You were a good sergeant. One of the best I had. What happened in '76 was unfortunate. But you and I understand the business well enough to know that sometimes decisions get made in the field that don't survive the review board, and the outcome of a review board is not necessarily a reflection of the decision itself. Sample listened to this. The Cutters are in custody, Hollis continued. They'll answer for the ridge. That's the outcome Pruitt contracted for. The other matter, the land holdings, the company, that's a civil question for lawyers and courts, and it'll take years and the outcome is not certain. He spread his hands. I'm offering you the same certainty I offered Toll. Walk away from the rest of it. The $400 from Pruitt is in your pocket. There's another $500 I can make available today, which gets you back to Brackettville with enough to be comfortable through the winter. The man to Sample's left shifted his weight. The man at the window had turned from the window. Sample looked at Hollis. He looked at the ranger's commission in the frame on the wall. He looked at the map with the red pencil parcels. He thought about a woman named Mrs. Ida Beaumont, who had been traveling to see her sister. He thought about Clyde Birch with his wife in Castroville, who kept a kitchen garden. He thought about the minister Pollard, and the surveyors Voss and Kellerman, and the cattle buyer Greer, and the driver Amos Purdy, and the young woman who had looked at Harlan Cutter on the ridge with the expression of someone who had always known something like this was out there somewhere. He had not let himself think about her in specific terms for the duration of this job, because specific terms were weight, and weight slowed you down. He let himself think about her now. No, he said. Hollis's face closed. It was a small closing, barely visible, but Sample had spent 4 years learning to read that face, and he read it. Eldridge. The district attorney's office is getting a copy of everything I gave the sheriff, Sample said. Deputy Renfrew, in Bexar County, has a sealed letter that opens in 72 hours regardless of what happens to me in the interim. Pruitt at Wells Fargo is expecting me this afternoon, and if I'm not there, he'll send word to Renfrew. He had set this up in the 2 days before arriving in San Antonio, which was time the slow ride from Brackettville had given him. The 2 men you had in Piedras Negras are still in Mexico. I'd leave them there. The man at the window said, Boss. Hollis raised one hand, a small flat gesture, and the man at the window went still. Hollis looked at Sample for a long time. The gold leaf on his name on the door threw a small reflection across the ceiling. Outside on St. Mary's Street, a cart went by, and the driver was talking to his mule about something, and the mule was not persuaded. You were always, Hollis started. Don't, Sample said. Hollis stopped. Stand up, Sample said. He produced the cord from his coat, the same cord he'd used on Dade Cutter in the ravine. Tell your men to sit down and stand up yourself. The man to his left looked at Hollis. Hollis looked at Sample. He looked at the desk, and at the commission on the wall, and at the map with the red pencil parcels, and at his own hands, the silver ring on the right, still plain, still the only ostentation he'd permitted himself. He looked like a man taking inventory of a life that had developed, somewhere in the last several years, a fatal flaw he'd been too busy to examine. He said, Sit down, boys. They sat. Both of them, which was its own kind of statement about what they understood. Hollis stood up. The Bexar County District Attorney was a man named Crane, who had been trying cases in San Antonio for 16 years, and who had developed the practiced equanimity of a man who has seen most of the ways the law can be tested, and has concluded that the law is more resilient than its detractors claim and more fragile than its defenders like to admit. He received Sample's documents on a Friday morning and spent an hour with them and then sent for a judge. The matter of Carter Hollis Burgess, the land fraud, the letter of credit, the contracted arrangement that had resulted in the deaths of 8 people on the Medina Ridge, would take 14 months to work through the courts. There would be lawyers and depositions and continuances and a change of venue motion that Hollis's attorney filed and that Crane opposed and that the judge denied. The 2 Ranger connections that Hollis had cultivated would turn out to be less loyal than he'd purchased them to be, which was a thing that happened when the purchase price started looking inadequate relative to the cost of loyalty. Toll's statement held up under cross-examination because Toll had nothing left to protect and knew it. Hollis was convicted on 6 of 9 counts. He was sentenced to 15 years at Huntsville. He served 11 before a disease that the prison physician called consumption and that Hollis himself called bad luck took him in the spring of 1891. He died with the silver ring on his finger because nobody had thought to take it, and because even at the end, there were things a man held onto, not out of sentiment, but out of the refusal to admit that they had cost him more than they were worth. The Cutter brothers were tried separately. Harlan pled to the arrangement the district attorney offered, full cooperation with the Hollis prosecution in exchange for a sentence of 20 years, which, given the nature of the charge and the number of the dead, was a transaction that Crane himself considered favorable to Harlan Cutter and said so in open court. Harlan said nothing in response, which the reporter for the San Antonio Daily Express described in his account as composure, and which was actually something else for which the reporter did not have a precise word. Dade did not take the offer. Dade's attorney argued that his client had been present at the scene, but had acted under the direction and influence of his older brother and of the principal who had arranged the matter. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Dade was convicted and sentenced to hang, and the sentence was carried out on a Tuesday morning in March of 1880 in the yard of the Bexar County Courthouse with 11 spectators and a Methodist minister who was not named Pollard. He went without a word, which surprised the 11 spectators and would have surprised anyone who had known him. But not Harlan, who knew that the grin and the mescal and the horse traders had always been on the surface of a man who, when it came to it, was level. He'd said so himself in a ravine in Mexico with a broken nose and his hands behind his back. Sample was not in the courthouse yard on that Tuesday morning in March. He was in Brackettville. He filed the paperwork with Pruitt on a Friday afternoon. Pruitt reviewed it with the attention he gave to all documents, which was careful and complete, and he wrote Sample a bank draft for $400 and slid it across the desk. "Delivery condition flexible," Pruitt said. He was looking at the draft, not at Sample. "That was your language," Sample said. "I know it was." Pruitt looked up. He was a man who had been managing bad news long enough not to be surprised by it. But something in his face had shifted over the course of this particular piece of bad news and hadn't shifted back. "The district attorney tells me the Hollis matter will run a year or more. At least. Will you be available if they need you to testify?" "I'm in Brackettville," Sample said. "I'm not hard to find." He folded the draft into his coat pocket and left Pruitt with his folder and his new piece of bad news, and went down Commerce Street for the last time in this matter. The afternoon light was getting long and gold across the limestone fronts of the buildings, and the street smelled of horse and dust and the river somewhere south, and whatever the cooks on Dolorosa Street were putting on for the evening, which smelled like something worth eating. He thought about stopping to see Celestina. He decided against it. Celestina already knew what had happened, or would know before he could tell her, and she did not need his accounting of it. She'd given him information when he needed it, and he'd used it, and the transaction was closed. That was the nature of what they had. He got the blood bay from the livery and rode west out of the city as the sun got into the last of its business with the day. The road to Bracketville was a road he knew, and the horse knew it, and they covered ground in the long evening light without hurrying. He arrived home in 3 days. He put the horse up and went into the stone house and opened the window on the east side that let in the morning air, and sat at the table with the bank draft and looked at it for a moment. $400. He folded it and put it in the tin box in the cabinet where he kept the things that needed to be kept, and closed the lid. In the morning, he watered the garden on the south side and found the squash had gotten ahead of him in his absence and would need to be taken to the family on the adjacent section. He carried what he could in a basket and left the rest for later. He ate breakfast at the table by the east window. Eggs from the neighbor's chickens, coffee he made in the manner he'd been making it for 30 years, and looked out at the country south of the house, which looked the same as it always looked, flat and dry and permanent, the greasewood and the lechuguilla running out toward the Rio Grande line. He was still sitting there when he heard a horse on the 2-track and looked up to see Deputy Renfrew coming through the cedar. Renfrew pulled up outside and dismounted and came to the door with his hat in his hands, which was a posture Sample associated with men who had something they felt obliged to say. "Mr. Sample." "Deputy." "Coffee's on." Renfrew came in and poured himself a cup and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the same country Sample had been looking at. He drank. "I read the report," he said, "and the statement from Toll, and the land office material." He turned the cup in his hands. "That's thorough work." "Thank you." "Crane, the district attorney, he says you closed a case his office didn't know was open." "It was open," Sample said. 8 people on a ridge tend to open things." Renfrew nodded. He drank his coffee. He was a decent man working his way around to whatever he'd come to say, and Sample waited for him to get there. "The sheriff wants to know if you'd consider a position," Renfrew said. "Special deputy. Contracted, not salaried. Your own terms. He says the county could use," he paused, working through the phrasing, "a man of your particular qualities." Sample looked at the country. He thought about the stone house and the squash and the coffee he'd been making in the same manner for 30 years, and the bad left knee that had gotten a thorough review in the last several weeks, and the 2-track that came off the main road for a 1/4 mile and then stopped because he'd decided that was far enough. He thought about the 8 people on the Medina Ridge and what he'd found at the end of 400 and some miles of this business, which was the thing he always found at the end of this kind of business, that it concluded, which was not the same as it being finished, and that the concluding was necessary but was not the point. The point was the 8 people. The point was always the 8 people. The work was the thing you did, so that the 8 people were not just a fact in a ranger's cold file. "Tell him I'll think about it," Sample said. Renfrew nodded, satisfied. He set his cup on the table and put his hat back on. At the door he stopped. "Something I've been wanting to ask," he said. "Ask." "When you brought Hollis in his office on St. Mary's Street, he had 2 men with him, by all accounts. Armed men." Renfrew paused. "I expect you knew they'd be there." "I expected something like it." "Didn't that concern you?" Sample considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Outside, a dove called from somewhere in the cedar, and the morning air moved through the open window with the particular quality it had in June before the heat got organized, cool enough to notice, warm enough to promise. I knew what I was going in there to do, he said. I'd done the work. I had the documents. I had the cord. He paused. Worrying about whether it would go wrong is a thing you do before you've done the work. After you've done the work, worrying is just weight you don't need. Renfrew turned that over. The sheriff's going to ask me how you feel about it, he said, bringing Hollis in. The whole of it. He'll want to know if you feel satisfied, I suppose. The dove called again, twice, and then was quiet. Sample picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the country south of the house, the flat, dry, permanent country that ran out toward the river and didn't change, and didn't ask anything of you except that you be honest about what you were, and what you were capable of, and what the work required. I feel accurate, he said. Renfrew looked at him. Then he put his hand on the doorframe and nodded once and went out to his horse. Sample listened to the hooves on the two-track going away through the cedar until they reached the main road and turned and were gone. He finished his coffee. Outside, the June morning came on in its own time, the way mornings do in country that has been doing this longer than anyone riding through it, hot already at 8 o'clock and going to get hotter and entirely unconcerned with the opinion of any man on the subject. The squash in the garden needed carrying. The coffee pot needed rinsing. The bloodbait needed a good look at his feet after 3 weeks of hard country. Eldridge Sample put his cup down and went out to see about the horse. The end.